Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men.
Today's map is of the disputed border between Egypt and Sudan. In particular, this bit here called Bir Tawil.
A bit of land the size of London, which nobody wants.
As with many badly drawn borders, it starts with the British.
So we'll draw a line here in the middle of the desert, ignoring all tribal boundaries, because we own this place anyway, so I don't really see it being a problem. Can I please have a sandwich?
It turns out the British got very good at drawing straight lines, seemingly unaware of all the trouble they were to cause. But once a line's been drawn, that's final, right?
Unright.
3 years later, in 1902, the British drew a new line to better reflect cultural differences.
We should never have drawn that straight line. I can assure you the man who drew that line has been shamed.
So now there were two borders, a straight one and a squiggly one.
And here came the problem. This area, known as the Halaib Triangle, was valuable and both sides wanted to control it. So Egypt claimed the straight line,
And Sudan claimed the squiggly line. The side effect? If either side claimed Bir Tawil, they'd have to give up the Halib Triangle.
it remains the only disputed territory in the world where both sides insist it's not theirs.
So we could just go and claim it.
Technically, yes.
In 2014, an American named Jeremiah Heaton travelled to Bir Tawil and claimed it for himself so that his 7-year-old daughter could fulfill her dream of being a real princess. Ain't nothing more important than my daughter's happiness. And now she's got everything she ever wanted. Isn't that right, Sugar Plum?
So, due to the value of the Halaib Triangle, Bir Tawil, with literally nothing in it, is internationally recognised as terra nullius.
And although many people have tried to claim it, including worryingly Google, a lack of UN recognition,
Or indeed any kind of recognition from anybody,
has left these claims as hollow as this globe. Goodbye.
Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men.
Today, we're looking at this 13th century Hereford Mappamundi, which is Latin for world tablecloth.
It lives on display in Hereford Cathedral, and you may have noticed it couldn't look less like the actual world. But that's because this particular map was orientated with east at the top, so if we rotate it, it still looks nothing like the world.
Incidentally, orientated means east at the top, hence Orient. There are no oceans and only 3 continents, Asia, Europe and Africa.
And this is supposed to be Britain.
Noah's Ark is in Armenia, the Garden of Eden is in Asia, and there's a bearded figure with mixed genitalia, a turban and a single breast. It's almost a good enough reason to visit Hereford.
Hereford's nice.
No, it's not.
It's all right.
Never been.
So because nothing on this map looks anything like anything, it makes using it to get from A to B somewhat difficult. Hi there, I'm trying to get to Babylon. Where are we?
But be fair, they didn't have the scientific knowledge in those days to get things right?
Wrong. 1,000 years earlier, in around 100 AD, a Greek scholar called Ptolemy produced this impressive-looking map of the known world, and he managed it using only equipment that looked like this.
I'm very clever.
But they weren't as silly as they look. Unlike maps today, this map wasn't trying to represent geographical space accurately.
I don't think it knows where we're going. In fact, all maps are just a representation of a particular world view.
No.
That's right. It's just like the tube map, which is great for showing what tube to get, but for everything else it's rubbish.
Hi there, I'm trying to get to Babylon.
So, what is the Hereford Mappamundi trying to do?
I know!
Mark.
It seeks to portray a global Christian hegemony by charting the history of creation, the soul's journey to the afterlife, detailing the resurrection of Christ and predicting the end of the world.
Well done.
Thank you.
So you could say the map is a guide for how to get to heaven.
I think we're in Ealing.
So given its aim is to map the Christian message, it actually does that pretty well.
Ignoring the stray mythological references to the Pillars of Hercules, unicorns, and the Minotaur's Labyrinth. Amen.
Amen.
And as the cartographic historian Jerry Brosson wrote, the Mappa Mundi looks forward to the moment of Christian judgment, the end of space and time, when there will be no need for geographers or maps.
Oh, don't be ridiculous. It's just a map. What harm could it do? Am I a northerner or a southerner?
That's easy. How do you pronounce this word?
Biv.
Welcome to Map Men. We're the men.
And here's the MIP.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men, men.
For the purposes of this episode, Jay is from the south of England, and I am from the south of England, because we both are.
Ever since the Vikings invaded the north of England and slowly spread the gene that lets you wear no clothes in the winter, the two sides have viewed each other with suspicion.
Northerners accuse Southerners of speaking with evil accents, going to Eton, and saying the word mahogany at least twice a day.
While Southerners accuse Northerners of being in Coronation Street and giving back videos you've lent them unrewound.
And it's important to know which side you're on. After all, it could affect your house price, education, or your life expectancy. Come on, you South!
So where exactly is the line? We'll now attempt to draw it.
Okay. From top to bottom, England is 423 miles long, and the halfway point is in the Foundry Shopping Centre in Scunthorpe, which is here.
But that would give the south a population 6 times bigger than the north, and it would put Sheffield in the south, and that just doesn't feel right. No, that just doesn't feel right, no.
So, let's take population spread into account.
We'll use your one.
So, here is a new map which shows the country split into an equal 26.5 million people on each side, and that puts the line here.
But that would put Norfolk in the north.
No,
that doesn't feel right either, no.
Let's see where the great British public feel it is. Well, our results were pretty inconclusive. Londoners drew the line immediately north of Watford,
Geordies drew the line immediately south of Sunderland.
and people from Birmingham kept insisting there's a place called the Midlands.
So people are idiots. What we need is a geography teacher. In 2007, a proper academic study was carried out by Professor Danny Dorling, taking a range of cultural and economic factors into account. This is the line he came up with.
What's noteworthy is that the line goes up at an angle, which puts Leicester, which is further north than Coventry, in the south, and Coventry, which is further south than Leicester, in the north, and vice versa.
And we can tell that Professor Dorling did his research properly, because the line is incredibly squiggly indeed.
So now, no matter where we live, we all know exactly which side of the line we're on.
Thanks, Danny!
But here at MapMen, we think we've spotted something of a trend.
It seems pronounced north-south divisions don't just affect England. Many countries have top-bottom rather than sidey-side splits.
New Zealand's North and South Island hate each other. Italy has a vicious economic north-south divide. The USA has its Mason-Dixon line.
And that's not mentioning the Koreas, Argentina, Belgium, France, Vietnam, and of course the entire world.
So, why north-south? Is it climate? Physiological bias towards top-bottom rather than sidey-side? Or is it just because lots of countries are tall rather than fat? Or is this theory just complete bollocks? We don't know, but why not argue about it in the comments section?
I will. Oh, I forgot Wales again.
Ah, Wales doesn't count.
Mahogany, mahogany.
Welcome to MapMen.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men, men.
Today's map is a 2015 map of the border between India and Bangladesh, an area riddled with enclaves.
An enclave is a piece of country wholly surrounded by another country, like a tic-tac inside a polo. This is a piece of Bangladesh which is in India.
And this is a second-order enclave, a piece of India which is in Bangladesh which is in India.
And this is the world's only third-order enclave in the world, a piece of India which is in Bangladesh, which is in India, which is in Bangladesh, which is insane.
Like a tic-tac inside a polo inside a bagel inside Bangladesh.
The problem for people living in smaller enclaves is they often lack access to basic resources, with the two countries often unwilling to share.
Worse still, with many enclaves too small to support their own emergency services, neighbouring paramedics awkwardly refuse to cross borders.
Help! I'm having a heart attack! I just need a defibrillator!
Can somebody help me, please?
The cruel irony is that in order to leave their enclave, residents need a visa, which they can only get by travelling to their embassy, which they can only do if they have a visa, which they don't.
So how did we end up in this ludicrous situation?
Amazingly, historians aren't really sure. All they know is it was the result of a confused end to a war in 1713 between various princes who couldn't be bothered to use a map to draw a clear border.
Calm down, Mark.
Fine, but they should have used a map.
Back in the 18th century, these patches of who owned what didn't matter like they do today. It was only when, you guessed it, the British came and went that the two provinces became separate countries, who incidentally hate each other.
The simple thing to do would be to swap these enclaves over, but for India, this was a problem because it would send out the wrong message.
Hello? Hello, Pakistan. It's Bangladesh. India are giving land away.
India are giving land away?
Hello?
Hello, China, it's Pakistan. India are giving land away.
India are giving land away?
But in 1974, enclave dwellers were offered hope when the two sides put together an agreement to swap their stray bits of land. Both sides signed it, and then Bangladesh ratified it. And India didn't.
So rude.
India decided they weren't happy with the small print, and the dispute continued for another 40 years. But as recently as 2015, India finally decided to put people first.
And they ratified the agreement.
On August the 1st, 2015, 161 enclaves were ceded to the country that contained them, setting thousands of people free.
And so we must pay our respects to this once great map, now sadly consigned to history.
Mark, save some for me. Welcome to Map Men,
We're the men.
and here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men, men, men.
This is a map of Berlin from 1988, with lots of normal map things, as well as 400 hectares of white.
That seems awfully suspicious.
It is awfully suspicious.
Ooh!
The area highlighted in blank was West Berlin, which was sealed off from the rest of East Germany by the Berlin Wall. And guns. The last thing the government wanted was a map of a thriving capitalist splodge with airports, shopping centres, and family members they used to be able to visit.
Just really want to fill it in.
Never draw on a map. But just because this map has a great gaping hole in the middle of it, doesn't mean it's right to say it's wrong.
Because no map is wrong.
And no map is right.
And all map is map.
Exactly.
Allow us to explain.
All maps have to make decisions about what they do and don't include, depending on what they're for. Here's Mark standing in Berlin. He's looking for the Starschen Heichenspitzenbasser Cafe.
Hello.
But here's Mark in Berlin as it appears on a map of the sewer system.
Ach, wohin sind den Buildings?
And here's Berlin as it appears on Google Maps.
Was? Ich habe eine Blaudot bekommen?
And here's Berlin as it appears on a map of violent crime. Luckily, Berlin's very safe. You see, no map can possibly contain all the information. If it contained all the information, it would look like this.
Now that's a map.
So, for East Germans who couldn't visit West Berlin, this map was accurate. West Berlin didn't exist.
Just like Rutland.
Rutland is real.
Rutland's a conspiracy.
So, we're not saying that this map is wrong.
What we're saying is, it's extremely silly. But this is not the only curiously blank map in the world. So here's our roundup of our favourite maps with gaps.
This Atlas of France can't be bothered to show the densely packed roads around Paris, so it looks like a massive empty field.
And this Google Maps image of East Asia suggests there are no roads or settlements in North Korea because somebody wouldn't let the cartographers in.
I won't let the cartographers in.
And this map makes it look like there's nothing in Greenland. Oh.
The Berlin Wall came down in 1989 in a classic episode of the news.
Germany have successfully erased any trace of the Berlin Wall, just as they did with Hitler's bunker car park.
That's what makes this creepy gap map so interesting. It tells the story of a bygone era when citizens' freedom of movement was restricted. But today, all the people of the world can go wherever they please and everything is fine.
I've drawn a wizard.
Welcome to Map Men,
We're the men.
and here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men, men.
Today, we're talking about a map of the sea.
Specifically, the South China Sea, which can be found here, just south of China, in this bit of sea.
Now, you might think there's not a lot of point in mapping the sea.
But if you look quite literally below the surface, you can find valuable fish stocks, oil reserves, and a giant swimming pool the size of an Earth-sized planet.
But given how many countries border this patch of sea, I feel like we're saying sea a lot.
There's nothing we can do about it.
Drawing up these borders can be more contentious than a 1960s East German Olympic blood sample.
First there's Brunei, with its neat yet noticeably phallic claim. Then we add Malaysia.
Then we add the Vietnamese claim. Then the Philippine claim. And finally the Chinese claim, which they call the 9-dash line. Ooh, harsh.
This leaves a corner of sea claimed by China, Vietnam, Brunei, Malaysia and the Philippines, which was ridiculous, but here at MapMen it's the sort of thing we really love.
The trouble is, painting a line in the sea doesn't really work. So what's a better way of proving that you own the sea?
The answer is land. Here in the middle of it all are the uninhabited Spratly Islands, a series of tiny reefs and sandbanks, and all the countries involved claim some for themselves so they can own the sea around them. And cheeky China have also been building innocuous things like gun turrets, helipads, naval ports and airstrips.
But it doesn't stop there. China have been using enormous dredging boats to build even more Spratly Islands, including this one, which is genuinely called Mischief Reef. So now it's land, and now it's theirs. Ow.
So why do people here, in China, care so much about control of the sea?
At the moment, Chinese ships can travel through this area as they please. But if there were a war, these narrow pathways could easily be blockaded.
Which could result in China's hugely export-orientated economy collapsing faster than a 1960s East German Olympic Stadium.
So for now, China is sticking with its 9-dash line. And would you mess with China? No. Analysts agree that this sticky sea situation is set to continue for at least hours.
I need a real bath. The United Kingdom is a country.
And that country is made up of the countries of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland, all of which are countries.
So the word country is overused. But we're here to country talk about the country of England and the country of Scotland country,
Specifically their border.
which is old
And contested.
and surprising.
Our favourite.
Welcome to MapMen.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men, men.
It all started hundreds of years ago when Roman Emperor Hadrian decided this part of Britain was worth it, but this part, probably not so much.
And so he built a wall, sending a message to any approaching army that if you want to attack us, you're going to have to place at least one hand on this stone and literally hop over.
South of the border became England, and north of the border became Scotland. Since Hadrian, the border between the two countries has ding-donged back and forth a bit, not least around this poor town, Berwick-upon-Tweed, which has swapped countries 14 times.
Although technically in England,
For now.
Berwick-upon-Tweed feels really Scottish. They read Scottish newspapers, their football team plays in the Scottish League, and their accent is a weird mix of Scottish and Geordie. Excuse me, would you say something?
Why, I'm indeed God, what you hanging about?
Ugh.
People got so confused about which country Berwick was in that official declarations of war in the 19th century had to specify you are at war with England, Scotland, and Berwick-upon-Tweed.
One particular war with Russia forgot to mention Berwick in the peace declaration, which means that Berwick was technically still at war with Russia until 1961. They undeclared war on each other in a ridiculous ceremony, where the mayor of Berwick declared,
The good people of Moscow can now sleep soundly in their beds.
The Russians responded by not knowing anything about it.
The England-Scotland border remains significant today.
It's well known that the Scots hate the English, but the English have never understood why those backwards Celts are such a bunch of whinging morons.
Well, that's what you get with a border that has hundreds of years of history.
Hundreds, you say?
Hundreds, I say.
Try 400 million.
What? Tell me more.
I bloody well will. This is what the world looked like 500 million years ago.
Well, I'm no evolutionary biologist, but that looks like around the time the first grapulites and cephalopods were formed.
Exactly. But at this point, England and Scotland are thousands of miles apart. The land set to spawn Sean Connery is here, and the land set to spawn Mr. Bean is here.
Mr. Bean was an alien.
The production company was English.
Well saved.
And about 400 million years ago, Avalonia and Laurentia collided together. Like this.
That dramatic collision formed the Scottish Highlands, once as tall as the Himalayas.
This map shows the border where they collided.
And this is the border today.
Ooh.
So, is it just a massive coinkydink that the line where the mega continents crashed into each other is pretty much exactly where today's England-Scotland border is? Or are the rocks from 400 million years ago still shaping the identities of these countries?
After all, the rocks underneath us affect what plants can grow, what local animals can eat, what building materials are available, and how tasty the tap water is.
So perhaps there is something in it, countries.
Isn't it great when a geographical border actually makes good geographical sense?
And who knows, maybe 400 million years from now, England and Scotland will break apart again.
And Scotland will be free to pursue a life of full, genuine independence as far away from England as possible.
Good luck with that. You know what this place needs?
A toilet?
Yes, but first, a nice decorative map on the wall.
I love a nice decorative map on the wall.
Great, I'll make one now.
Welcome to Map Men. Today we're... Hey, can you stop that?
Can you stop that?
That's really irritating. Stop it.
Stop it.
I'm an idiot.
You're an idiot.
Today we're talking about the thorny issue of map copying.
As everyone knows, it's not a nice feeling when you've worked very hard on something and somebody steals it.
Like that time I painstakingly drew a fake map of the India-Bangladesh border and it turned up in an episode of Geography Now.
In the olden days, map making was an expensive and time-consuming business.
When Phyllis Pearsall created the iconic A to Z of London in 1936, she had to get up at 5 a.m. and walk around for 18 hours every day writing down all the street names.
But thanks to Phyllis's hard work, if I want to make my own map of London today, all I have to do is copy her map and then give it a catchy title like the top to bottom alphabetically indexed map of London, and I'll be rich.
No, you won't, Snookums. If you try that, you'll be found out.
How?
Because the A to Z, like many other maps, is filled with trap streets.
Did you just call me Snookums?
Trap streets are unique and deliberately wrong little details designed to cause no problem to the map user, but a big problem for anyone trying to copy it.
Sometimes the cartographer will make a road more bendy.
Or they'll deliberately spell one of the names wrong.
Or, most excitingly, they'll add completely non-existent places.
Excuse me, does your map show the village My Girlfriend?
Of course, it's here on page 5.
Aha! You stole my map! My girlfriend doesn't exist. It never has and never will.
Clever in theory, but are there any real examples from real map history of where this has really been done?
There really are.
In 1936, the official map of Boulder County, Colorado, contained the fictional Mount Richard, the name of which was chosen at random by the map's creator, Richard Ciacci.
Another.
In 1936,
Hang on. That's the third time 1936 has come up this episode.
How strange. I used to live at number 36.
And I'm thinking about the number 36 right now.
Spooky.
In 1936, Esso created a fake town called Aglo on this empty spot on their map of New York State.
But then, in the 1950s, a shop was built on that spot, and the owners, looking at the Esso map, decided to call it the Aglo General Store.
Years later, another map company called Rand McNally tried to copy Esso's map, and then Esso tried to sue them. But the joke was on Esso because, thanks to the general store, Aglo had now become a real place and the case was thrown out.
Another more recent one.
In 2011,
I love how recent that is.
the AA were caught copying an Ordnance Survey map and were forced to pay £20 million worth of justice.
Apparently the traps on the OS maps were so sophisticated it allowed copycats to be caught without publishing anything really inaccurate. OS said,
"There are some publishers who put deliberate mistakes in their maps. We don't do that."
The problem is, trap streets by their nature are very tricky to find.
In fact, if you ask map makers if their maps have any inaccuracies, they deny it.
Hello?
Hi, is your map full of mistakes?
No, it's not.
See?
So we've made it our mission to set out and find examples of trap streets that can be seen in up-to-date maps you can buy today.
Right, off we go.
Wait, if you can teleport, why are we in a car?
There's one. According to the 2005 A to Z, there's a road going through this park called Whitfield Road. But there isn't.
No, there isn't.
Aha!
This here is Book Mews, but the A to Z calls it Brook Mews. Cheeky.
Oh, look, there's another one. Google Maps says there should be an entire town called Argleton here. But in real life, it's just an empty field.
But of course, it's pretty easy to catch out a Google Maps trap street because all you have to do is click satellite view.
and anyone who wants to make their own map can just copy that.
Which is basically what everyone does and nobody cares.
If you can think of any trap streets that we've missed and want to mention it in the comment section below,
Don't.
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 Thanks.
Don't.
Today, we'll be asking, is the world definitely round?
Yes.
Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men, men.
Here at Map Men, we love a good globe.
Because it's a map, but also a toy.
But globes aren't very convenient because they're bulky and difficult to carry around.
Unless your friends attach one to your head for your stag do and make you wear it all around Bristol.
So, if you want the world in a book, or a poster, or a shower curtain, that globe is going to have to be flattened. But it's a notoriously challenging task.
The best way to demonstrate the difficulty of displaying the curved Earth on a flat map is to take an easy peel orange, and you'll find that even with a rolling pin, you just can't make the damn thing flat. Stupid orange, stop being round, stop being flat! But you can make juice.
The only exception is the map produced by the Flat Earth Society, because apparently this is a real bird's eye view of the world. Antarctica conveniently encircles the Earth to stop the water falling off.
So because flat earthers don't believe in the globe, they're not actually distorting it, but they are distorting the minds of vulnerable loners scouring the internet for answers in an increasingly incomprehensible world.
Meanwhile, us gullible round Earth believers have a dilemma. You can't flatten a round thing without ruining it. You either have to stretch bits, squash bits, or slice bits. But a clever solution came along in 1569 from a Belgian man...
Flemish. Belgium wasn't a thing.
Flemish man called Gerard Mercator.
This is my Mercator costume.
Yeah, Mercator was a globe maker who loved cricket and stag doos. His ingenious solution was to imagine the Earth like a balloon covered in ink, and then imagine the balloon in a big cardboard tube, and then imagine inflating the balloon inside the tube, and then unfolding the big cardboard tube and looking at the results.
This was impressive for a man who'd never travelled more than 200 kilometres from where he was born, and especially impressive as they hadn't even invented balloons or big cardboard tubes, or Belgium.
Mercator's projection became so successful it stood the test a very, very long time, and earned its status as the official, definitive flat map of the world. Maps using the Mercator projection have been used extensively in schools, TV weather maps, bad tattoos. It's even used by Apple Maps.
So it's great. The end.
Whoa! Hold your onions, Sonny Jim my lad, my boy. The Mercator projection is not without its problems. When you inflate a balloon in a tube, the top of the balloon has to stretch to touch the sides. As a result, countries near the poles look bigger.
This has the naughty effect of making Greenland look about the same size as all of Africa, when in real life it's about the size of Greenland.
As well as being inaccurate, more worryingly, it's a bit racist. It's well known that the Mercator projection was designed to make the colonial powers of Northern Europe look bigger and make Africa look smaller.
Well, that's wrongly well known. The Mercator projection had nothing to do with racism and everything to do with navigation.
Before Mercator, all maps had a problem. If you were a sailor and tried following a straight line on the map, the curvature of the Earth meant you gradually drift off course. But with the Mercator projection, a straight line on the map was the same as a straight line on the sea, as long as your compass wasn't broken.
Okay, I hereby concede that the Mercator projection is not racist on purpose, but it was still a problem that needed solving.
So, in the 1970s, a German man called Arno Peters tried to make a better map.
Why is this my Arno Peters costume?
Revenge.
Oh. The Peters projection sacrifices accuracy of shape in favour of accuracy of scale. The polar regions are squished and the bits near the equator are stretched, fixing the Greenland problem and making Russia look far less intimidating. It's a great map.
It's a terrible map.
Why?
First of all, Arno is a stupid name. Secondly, he wasn't a map maker, he was a publicist who copied the work of James Gall, work which was so abundantly terrible it should never have been copied in the first place. Look at the shape of Africa. It's awful.
Can I say something controversial?
Go on.
So what? Ask yourself, what is the point of a map on a classroom wall? Is it to teach children how to navigate the ocean in a boat? No, it's so they can understand the world around them. And understanding something like Africa is huge is pretty important.
I think it's important that Africa doesn't look like a sad piece of melted cheese.
Well, ultimately, there is no right answer.
Except mine.
Because every flat map of a round world is necessarily wrong. But loads of mapmakers have tried to come up with their own solutions over the years.
And here are a few of our favourite attempts.
Ugh. Oh, that's clever.
No.
Ooh, pointy.
Not bad, but quite bad.
Nope. Ah!
So it looks like the only way round the pesky projection problem is to join the Flat Earth Society. Jay, will you do the honours?
Gladly.
Come on, be flat, you stupid round thing! Be flat, flatten! Why aren't you flat, you stupid big round thing?
Hey Mark, what country am I supposed to be?
Offensive France.
Bienvenue à Homme Carte.
Nous sommes les hommes.
Et voilà, la carte.
Carte, carte.
The Cassini family map of France is quite possibly the most incredible map ever made.
Considering how old it is,
Very. It's astonishing how accurate it is.
also very.
And the story behind it is pretty astonishing too.
Before the Cassinis, the best map of France looked like this. Not bad.
But also, definitely not good.
In those days, maps weren't very precise. They were more like works of art. But King Louis XIV wanted to know exactly what he was king of, and he wanted a great big map on his bedroom wall. So he called his cartographer friend Giovanni Cassini.
Monsieur, je voudrais une carte.
Une carte.
Une carte, oui, une carte. Très grande de mon France.
Bof, je commence.
But of course, it was a lot trickier than just saying boff.
When Cassini googled satellite photography, he found an article saying that it wouldn't be invented for another 300 years. So Cassini had no option but to use an old-fashioned yet ingenious process called triangulation.
Triangulation works by making triangles. You start by measuring the distance between 2 points.
Then you spy out a third point and measure the angles towards it with a massive protractor. Using these measurements,
And a bit of maths.
you can plot a stunningly accurate triangle on your map, no matter how big or bumpy the terrain is.
Simply repeat the process over and over again, et voila, a complete and thoroughly accurate map.
Cassini travelled around France with his triangle measuring machinery for years and years until he was too dead to carry on.
So his son, Cassini Jr., took over from his dead dad and continued measuring.
Then Cassini Jr. died and was replaced by his son, Cassini Jr. Jr., the first Cassini's grandson.
They had first names, you know.
No one cares. Back then, France was mostly a poverty-stricken rural backwater and not overly partial to the arrival of strangers.
Plus ça change.
This made map-making a dangerous endeavour.
In 1740, the villagers in Les Estables brutally hacked one of Cassini's surveyors to death, believing their strange tools and modern science were the cause of their failed harvest.
Bang, 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 ow, bang, ow, ow, bang, bang.
But eventually, the Cassinis covered all 600,000 square French kilometres of France and produced this, a map made entirely of triangles.
The king, who by now was a different king, was delighted, until he noticed something wrong.
Zut alors, qu'est-ce que c'est?
Is there a problem?
My country is 20% smaller than I thought it was. You have taken more from me than I won in all my wars. I actually said this.
But your highness, you literally asked for an accurate map.
Well, you could at least bother to fill it in with some details, like villages and rivers, so it's not just triangles.
So Cassini Jr. Jr. set about turning his very accurate map into a very useful map.
Every church, every farm, every copse, every petrol station was painstakingly marked in the very first modern map of its kind.
And then Cassini Jr. Jr. died and was replaced by Cassini Jr. Jr. II until the job was finished.
4 generations of the same family taking over 120 years to complete a task is a pretty impressive level of commitment.
In today's terms, that's like someone watching a YouTube video all the way to the end.
In 1793, the Cassini family's now completed enormous 12 by 11 metre map comprising 182 sheets of incroyable detail was proudly
stolen by the people who'd executed the king the year before.
Napoleon decided the Cassini family's long association with the crown made them enemies of the revolution, and so they confiscated the map, prevented its public use, and threw Cassini in jail.
Napoleon milked the map for magnificent military manoeuvres. It also inspired the Ordnance Survey maps here in Britain, and ushered in an age where maps were less about art and more about accurate accuracy.
How astonishing. But perhaps the most astonishing thing about... Oh, that's my time up. Now time for my son to take over.
Your son?
Yep. Here you go, Jay Jr. Just carry on where I left off.
Didn't know he had a son.
Yes, one flight to Boston, please.
Oh, you're going on holiday to Boston?
No, it's not a holiday.
Hey, Mark, what time is it?
Hang on. Let me just... Okay, let me just decode the... It's the afternoon.
Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map men, map men, map men, men.
Back in the olden days, people would tell time by the sun.
What time is it?
I don't know, I've gone blind.
But then, in the 18-somethings, when they invented trains, suddenly it mattered what the exact time was.
One man famously travelled from London to Bristol by train, and then the time was 10 minutes different, and then he missed his train home, or something like that, and so standard time was invented.
For a short while, some towns were using both local time and railway time, but this confusing, cluttery clock-up just made even more people miss their trains.
This is the East London suburb of Greenwich, where you don't pronounce the W or one of the E's.
And right here is the place where British Standard Time was standardised. Since 11 o'clock in the morning on the 2nd of August 1880, it's been exactly the same time all across the British Isles. Greenwich Mean Time.
Greenwich Mean Time started a trend and soon became a standard the world over for your local country to be a certain number of hours either behind or ahead of.
Here is a map showing all the time zones around the world. Each bar is measured as the number of hours before or after Greenwich Mean Time, or UTC. But as you can see, the lines are not straight.
They bend slightly around country borders, as you might expect them to, but what we're interested in is how they bend massively around weird things, as you may well not expect them to.
So, here's our Mapmen guide to the world's best time zone anomalies.
China.
China is one massive time zone. They've done this for unity and simplicity, but it has a few consequences. If you cross the border from Afghanistan to China, time jumps ahead by 3.5 hours.
Tea time, dinner time, tea time, dinner time.
Secondly, and much more importantly, in Tibet, in winter, the sun doesn't rise until 10 a.m.
Because of this, some people in Xinjiang have adopted their own local unofficial time zone.
But the Han community who also live there refuse to recognise it. All efforts to correct this have inevitably failed.
Unity and simplicity, my front bottom.
America.
In Arizona, there are some areas that do observe daylight savings and some that don't. This means that for half the year, driving through the state means you have to keep a close eye on your watch.
She's gonna be okay. She's gonna be okay. Oh, it was too late. I couldn't save her in time. Everybody's gonna hate me because I... Oh, thank God. I'm gonna make it. I'll be a hero. She'll survive.
Changing the hour is one thing, but the most curious curiosities happen at the controversial and ever-changing International Dateline.
The line where Tuesday changes into Wednesday.
The Diomedes. The Diomede Islands live here in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. This one to the west belongs to Russia and is the furthest east you can go in the world. And this one to the east belongs to America and is the furthest west you can go in the world.
The International Dateline splits these two islands down the middle, which means that even though they're only 2.5 miles apart, there's a whole day between them.
During the Cold War, a woman called Lynn Cox swam from one to the other across the so-called Ice Curtain, drawing congratulations on her brave statement of peace, even though all she really wanted was for it not to be Monday.
Kiribati.
Kiribati.
Really?
Yep.
For many decades, Kiribati was on the right-hand side of the dateline, and they were the last people on the planet to do anything. But this caused a problem.
Every Friday morning, when the Kiribatians were eager to do business with their biggest trading partners, Australia, the Aussies were sleeping off their Saturday morning hangovers.
Not now, Messina.
So, on New Year's Day 1995, they jumped across to the left-hand side of the dateline, skipping a day ahead to join their business partners in Hangoverland.
Why are you still calling me?
This meant that Saturday the 31st of December 1994 never happened.
As a consequence of Kiribati changing from one side to the other, the International Dateline now looked like an Easter Island head.
And their time-travelling tactic triggered a trend.
Boff.
In 2011, they were joined on the new side of the dateline by the nation of Samoa.
Samoa.
Really?
No, I don't know.
That's what we love about the lines on this map. They don't show distance from Greenwich, semicolon. They show a rich tapestry of culture and allegiances.
The surprisingly sinuous zigs and zags of the world's time zones demonstrate that it is not time that controls us humans, but rather us humans who control time.
Well,
Us humans who control time.
well,
Us humans who control time.
well,
Us humans who control time.
Paste.
Well, us
Paste.
humans who control
Paste.
time.
well.
Paste.
Stop doing that! Oh, Mrs. Doubtfire.
Yes, got it in one.
My turn. This episode was written during the coronavirus lockdown.
And it's not an uncoincidence that it's about a map that stopped a deadly disease.
Welcome to Mapmen.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men, men.
200 years ago, cholera was one of the most feared illnesses or indeed anythings in the world.
Nobody knew how it spread or where it came from, but they did know that if you got it, there was a 50% chance you would die, sometimes within just one day.
And a pretty unpleasant final day it would be too. Within hours, cholera can cause teeth to protrude, eyes to sink and blood to thicken and turn blue, giving cholera its nickname, the Blue Terror.
I'm terrified.
This is because cholera causes the body to lose as much water as possible in the shortest possible time, as much as 20 litres in a day.
Because it spread so quickly between people, scientists spent literally hours thinking about ways to fix cholera. To a man, they were all convinced it was passed around through bad air, which they called miasma to try and sound clever.
It wasn't until someone called Jon Snow, not that Jon Snow, not that Jon Snow, this Jon Snow, did some thinking of his own that progress was finally made.
The story starts in Old York in the olden days. John grew up in a poor part of the city where sewage flowed openly in the street and filth was a fact of life.
Oh, look! An apple! Snow was so grossed out by it, he became unusually health conscious and styled himself an 21st century hipster. He didn't drink alcohol, was a vegetarian, and insisted on only drinking distilled water.
Snow escaped his life of squalor by being very good at maths and was offered a place at Newcastle to train as a physician.
He first witnessed the grim effects of cholera while treating patients in the nearby coal mining town of Killingworth.
He noticed that men who worked down the pit were dying of cholera at exactly the same rate as everyone else, even though they were nowhere near the foul air of the town. He began to suspect cholera had nothing to do with bad air, instead suspecting it might instead have something to do with the water instead.
But because Victorian scientists really enjoyed using the word miasma, they all ignored his radical theory.
Snow would need hard proof to convince the doubters, and finally got the chance years later when he moved down to London.
In 1854, cholera struck Soho in the heart of London, and Jon Snow had just moved into a house in the heart of Soho, on Sackville Street, right by the Itsu. He was in the perfect place at the perfect time.
Yes! I mean, how awful. Snow went from door to door recording as much as he could about the cases that had occurred so far.
Cholera?
Good. Excitingly, he then plotted his data onto a map.
When Snow looked at the data he'd collected, he made an astonishing discovery. Almost all the recorded cases occurred near the Broad Street water pump. The further from the pump he went, the fewer deaths he recorded. A clear pattern had emerged.
What Jon Snow was doing was one of the earliest known examples of data journalism, which doesn't sound sexy and isn't sexy, but I still like it.
Still, in order to finally prove to all the miasmarists out there that it really was the pump, Snow needed a watertight case.
That's a good pun.
I know.
But there appeared to be some anomalies, such as an isolated case miles away to the north in Hampstead. How did the cholera get all the way up there?
He went to speak to the elderly victim, and it turned out her niece had been bringing her the water from Broad Street because, like many others, she thought the Broad Street water tasted sweeter.
And we'll try not to think about the fact that sweeter, in this case, was another way of saying contains sewage. As well as cases far away from the pump, there was another type of anomaly that needed explaining. Non-cases really close to the pump, such as the workhouse on nearby Poland Street, which had bizarrely recorded hardly any deaths at all.
So Snow went to visit the workhouse and found they had their very own water well for water. What a surprise!
There were also no deaths at the local ale distillery. When Snow tried to interview people who worked there, nothing they said made any sense.
Which made sense because it turned out that instead of getting cholera, they'd been getting drunk. No water, no cholera. Every apparent setback to Snow's water theory only ended up making his case even waterier and tighterier than ever before.
So he took his map to the local health commission, who were convinced enough to remove the handle from the Broad Street pump.
And a good job they did, because the cases immediately started drying up.
The other two were better.
Yeah, I know.
But how did that pump get infected in the first place? He found the answer with the help of a holy gossip monger.
Henry Whitehead, the local priest, knew everybody's business, including who had diarrhea when.
With a combination of Whitehead's nosiness and Snow's clever map-making, they were able to trace the outbreak back to case 0, a baby living at number 40, whose mother had been washing nappies into the house's underground cesspit.
Not unsurprisingly, they found cracks between the cesspit and the well, finally confirming that everyone had been drinking number 40's number 2s.
We have to take our hats off to this gruesome twosome for collecting so much data over what must have been months of work.
Actually, the whole endeavour from start to finish took just 3 days.
Wow! Shockingly, despite all the evidence they gathered, and with the outbreak cleared up as a result of their work, the mainstream miasmarists continue to ignore Jon Snow's findings, and the local council soon popped the handle back on the Broad Street pump as if nothing was ever wrong with it.
As always seems to happen when someone does something amazing, Jon Snow died before his work was accepted. Luckily today, medical experts are always taken seriously, and their advice is always listened to by people in charge who are never interested in personal political gain over rigorous, evidence-led, peer-reviewed scientific facts.
Except sometimes it isn't, which is why every year to this day, the medical community holds the Pump Handle Lecture, during which a mock handle is ceremonially removed and replaced in recognition of the struggle of getting people in charge to listen to doctors. Perhaps the most fun way Jon Snow is remembered today is in the form of this pub, the Jon Snow pub.
We're not sure how the famously teetotal Jon Snow would have felt about this, but either way, cheers to Jon Snow.
Cheers.
Tastes quite sweet. Hello, I'm Edward.
And I'm William.
And you join us at the start of a motortastic road trip. Over the next 52 days, we're going to be visiting every single motorway service station in Britain.
British place names can be tricky to pronounce.
Take this place. Looks simple. But what if we told you it was pronounced Grimsby?
We'd be lying. It's Grimsby.
But other places can be genuinely fiddly for foreigners.
And tourists who get it wrong risk being imprisoned or killed.
In today's programme, we're going to ask why British place names are so hard to pronounce.
Is there an and coming?
No, I'm done.
Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, 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 map men, men.
There are difficult to pronounce place names all over the world.
California has Zizix, Slovenia has Ptuj, Greenland has
Kekertarsuit.
Even Welsh natives struggle with this one.
And tonight we can expect to see heavy showers spreading from the west into Wales.
But deliberately hard to pronounce names invented for promotional purposes like Llanfair Pwllgwyn Gwrgogera Drobl Llantysilio Gogogoch aside,
show off.
British place names cause more trouble than most because they often look straightforward but contain nonsensical phonetic traps that are impossible to predict.
Try this one.
Go on, say it out loud, in your room or on your train.
Ha 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 ha! Wrong, it's not Frome.
Frome, it should be blitheringly obvious, is pronounced Froome.
But if you did say Frome, don't worry, you're in good company. Frome is officially the most mispronounced place name in Britain, and that's according to a proper survey.
Excuse me, could you mispronounce Froome for me?
Portsmouth.
That'll do. There's nothing more fun than laughing at tourists who don't know how to say something properly simply because they're from a different country and could never reasonably be expected to have predicted a local pronunciation that contradicts the basic rules of language.
So, we've created the perfect travel agent's itinerary for maximising tourist humiliation across the country.
Starting in Biaulio,
Beauty,
head over to Rampisham,
Ransom,
then down to Mousehole.
Mousehole,
next travel north up to Towcester,
Toaster,
then a quick jaunt to Gotham,
Gotham,
followed by a stop in Quernmore,
Quorma,
before finishing up in Alnwick.
Alnwick, which is near Newcastle.
Or, as the people from the city itself say, Newcastle.
When will they learn? As you can hear, no letter of the English alphabet is safe from being pronounced any of dozens of different ways.
Including not at all.
Thankfully, there are some general rules you can stick to, and because we're nice, we'll help the un-British amongst you through a couple of basics.
Cester is pronounced stir.
Leicester, Worcester, Gloucester.
W at the start of the final syllable is silent.
Norwich, Berwick, Southwark.
ER is pronounced R.
Berkshire, Clerkenwell, Hertfordshire.
But before you get too reassured, for every rule in the English language there are always exceptions, such as the Cester in
Cirencester,
the W in
Sandwich,
and the sound in
this is disgusting. Oh, sorry, Berkhamsted.
Which is in Hertfordshire.
The only way to be absolutely sure of pronouncing British place names correctly is to live here long enough to learn every single one of them, one at a time. Sorry.
So who were the complete anchors that invented these rules?
It's time for an English lesson.
To make an English language, you start with the base of Germanic Anglo-Saxon. Mix in a healthy dash of Old Norse, a huge dollop of Norman French, and just a barely detectable hint of Celtic. Trust me, it'll make all the difference. Stir it up for hundreds of years until the vowels really start to shift, and then English.
Excitingly, by looking at a map of Britain today, we can clearly see which invaders influenced our language where by plotting the origins of British place names. This marvellous, messy, multicoloured map shows which languages different British place names belong to and is a living history of our early settlers and subsequent invaders.
The oldest place names here are of Celtic origin. This is where you'll find all the place names with words like Tre, Loch, Bryn and Aber.
Such as Aberystwyth, meaning the mouth, Aber, of the River Istwyth.
Which coincidentally is exactly where we find Aberystwyth today.
Celtic languages were once spoken all across the British Isles, but are now reduced to a small minority of mountain dwellers. And that's because low-lying Middle England Brits turned out to be more worse at resisting invading armies.
First up were the Romans, who brought in Britain's Latin influences.
Like the rumba?
No, like boring Latin. Anywhere that ends in caster, cester, chester or xeter was a Roman fort, from the Latin word castra, meaning Roman fort.
But the Romans didn't stay long, so although their naming system was long-lasting, the actual names they used weren't, which is perhaps unsurprising when we learn they used names like Castra Exploratorum and Belgic Oppidum,
which was sensibly renamed Braintree.
Next, in light pink, we have the biggest group, Germanic Anglo-Saxon.
Any place containing the words Ham, Hurst, Lee, Bury, Ford, Port, Mere, Stead, Tunstall, Wick, Witch or Mere are of good old Anglo-Saxon origin and massively dominate southern England.
Like Buckingham.
Or a low-lying area of land belonging to an Anglo-Saxon called Bucca.
Perhaps the most upheavaling thing to happen to Britain's place names was the Vikings, who swept in from Scandinavia in the 9th century, committing brutal crimes including rape, pillage and the renaming of small to medium-sized settlements.
You can tell a place was named by the Vikings if it ends in Thwaite, Thorpe, Kirk or B.
Such as our old friend Grimsby. Named after an important Viking called Grim, famed for his infectious positive energy, Grimsby literally means Grim's village.
Really? We're all familiar with these common settlement suffixes, but what's so striking is how clearly this map of Viking place names reflects the extent of the Viking invasions. You can practically see the exact location of the Danelaw dividing Viking and Anglo-Saxon England without needing to draw it on with thick red pen.
Following all these invasions, Britain was littered with place names that originated in different languages and accents, but the final thing that would make its place names truly unpronounceable was time.
Over hundreds of years, locals who were too busy to pronounce all the syllables in Cester reduced it to stir to save time. But they couldn't read or write, so the spelling stayed the same.
And while the English language has continued to gradually evolve, our place names haven't, resulting in a language landscape littered with phonetic booby traps.
But what about Frome? Which linguistic group is responsible for Britain's so-called hardest place name?
Unusually for a place name in England, Frome is from a surviving Celtic word, frama, which means fair, fine or brisk, probably describing the flow of its lovely river.
It's not really surprising that the oldest language in these islands is the one that's drifted the furthest from pronounceability.
So don't forget to join us for the next episode of Map Men.
Is that the end of your sentence?
Yeah, I'm done. What have the Russians ever done for us?
What, apart from vodka, Tchaikovsky, the periodic table, radiators and winning World War II?
Yes.
Nothing.
Wrong. This is the story of perhaps the greatest and secretest mapping exercise ever undertaken.
Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men.
This is a map of the southeast of England. It's geographically recognisable, but the spelling seems a little, well, Polish. There's Istbon,
Sorfend on Sje,
Hedgesteins,
Zylinem,
Tambrides Lels.
Where did this hilarious map come from?
It was made for the use of the Polish Air Force. All the notoriously hard-to-pronounce English place names have been transliterated, spelt phonetically so the Polish pilots can pronounce them as Britishly as possible.
It's actually quite useful for doing the opposite of what it was meant for, teaching English speakers how to spell in Polish.
My Polish is better already.
Dobre zbronie.
Yes. It dates back to the Cold War, at a time when both sides were preparing for it to suddenly get hot.
This famously involved America and Russia massing enough nuclear warheads to destroy the entire world many times over, which at the time was considered a perfectly reasonable use of taxpayer money.
But it less famously involved the Soviet production of thousands of maps that, to this day, very few people know very little about, with even more people knowing even less.
These were part of an enormous military mapping exercise begun by Stalin and continued by a series of other, less famous but probably nicer, Russian leaders throughout the Cold War.
Because they're Soviet-made, you might expect these maps to be somehow laughably defective, like the ones we discussed in an episode about Soviet maps that left enormous blank spaces for places they wanted people to forget about. Don't watch it now, watch it later.
But this belies their true map-making brilliance, because as we're about to see, they were actually scarily good at it. Here's a British-made OS map of Pembroke Dock from 1953, with a conspicuous lack of detail in this flying boat base, which, by the way, should surely be called a swimming plane base.
Definitely. But the secret Soviet map of the same area from 1950 has far more detail, including buildings, dockyards, and an entire pier that the OS left out.
Even American military maps were out-accurated by the Russians. Here's the USGS version of Hanscom Field Air Force Base, and here's the Soviet version from the same time. And in a far too easy game of spot the difference, the American map doesn't show the security fence, doesn't show this runway extension, and doesn't show this runway at all. So, how did the Russians do it?
In 1962, the Soviets got an automatic map contemporizing plugin, the Zenit Satellite Program.
This meant they could easily spot American runway extensions from the safety of the Earth's orbit.
But a space bird's-eye view doesn't tell the whole story. The Soviets would no doubt have loved to know the location of the UK's 11 bunkers for the regional seats of government in case of nuclear war, like this one in Cambridge, which from the air just looks like another boring bit of university building.
Also, spotting a long trench being dug in Teesside, the Russian cartographers guessed this to be a road under construction, when in fact they were just laying gas pipes.
Idiots.
So to help them fill in the blanks, the Soviets weren't averse to simply copying published maps that already existed. In fact, they perfected the art of copying old maps to an impressive T. Their 1990 map of Bradford includes exact spot heights that feature on 3 different editions of OS maps from 1982, 1938 and 1909.
So either the Russians just happened to survey the heights of the exact same spots, or more likely they showed a flagrant disregard for British copyright law.
Even the apparently simple art of map copying has its pitfalls, which led to some revealing mistakes.
On this map of London, Her Majesty's Theatre is labelled in the index as Residence of the Queen.
Prince Philip, I'm home!
If the Russians were going to get the competitive edge they needed in the Cold War map-off, they were going to have to employ the ultimate and Cold Warriest of weapons: spies.
The rapid expansion of Russian spying under Stalin continued throughout the century until no matter where you lived in the world, you were always at least 10,000 miles from a Russian spy. secret agents would go on extended foreign tours to gather intelligence.
In a bid to blend in unnoticed, a popular tactic was for agents to set up a picnic close to a construction site, giving them a chance to have a good nosy at whatever this building, road, railway or pipeline was all about.
It's remarkable and terrifying how much information the Soviets were able to gather for their maps that could only have been procured through spies. They recorded the names of factories and what they produced, measured the loading capacities of bridges, and even went as far as to note the average distances between trees in woodland.
This is not what I signed up for.
Even though the Russians were mapping different cultures and landscapes from across the world's continents, all their maps were produced in an impressively standardised form.
There was a clear colour scheme and a list of symbols so comprehensive that officers were given a 220-page handbook to help them read the maps properly. The only reason we've begun to understand the scale of Soviet mapping at all, given these maps were,
and still are,
heavily classified, is in no small part thanks to two British authors.
In 2017, John Davies and Dr. Alexander Kent published The Red Atlas, How the Soviet Union Secretly Mapped the World, which we absolutely have to mention, not only because it's excellent, but also because it's the only source material available on the topic.
How John and Dr. Alex got their hands on the maps in the first place is a pretty remarkable story in its own right. After the Cold War became more of a lukewarm peace, ex-Soviet officers were ordered to ship classified material back to Moscow or have it destroyed, including thousands of secret maps.
Opportunistic map dealers spotted a chance to pick up some illicit cartography, making them available to the West for the first time. It was only when John and Dr. Alex went travelling around map shops of Eastern Europe that anybody discovered the scale of what the Soviets had achieved.
Ooh. Thanks to their colossal cartographic collecting, we now know how the Soviets made their incredibly detailed maps. But the scarier thing to think about is why?
Looking at all of these maps together reveals something fascinating. They don't suggest a superpower preparing to blow the world to smithereens. Instead, the attention to detail suggests they wanted to leave it unnuked and merely invade and own this territory.
An invasion that would have included their Polish allies, which explains our funny phonetic Polish map. On the one hand, it's a chilling foreboding of a gruesome invasion that thankfully never took place.
On the other, it's nice to know that if the Polish troops had invaded, they'd have at least been thoughtful enough not to pronounce it Frome.
Today, the threat of conflict between East and West is within satisfactory levels, but Russian spying is nonetheless still very much a thing. There could be a Russian spy hiding in your computer right now.
It's heavily rumoured that Jay is in fact a Kremlin Twitter bot.
Koshmar!
Thankfully, the Soviet maps were never used for their intended purpose of invading the baddies, or as we in England call them, the goodies. But that doesn't mean they haven't been used at all.
When the US invaded Afghanistan in 2001, it was Soviet maps they turned to for help, as they included far more detail than their own versions, including, for example, the different times of year that various mountain roads were passable.
The maps were also widely used by big oil companies as they explored new areas for drilling across Africa and Asia.
So perhaps there's one more thing we should add to the list of things the Russians did for us, which is something they did for them, tried desperately to conceal, but was of such high quality it escaped anyway to assist with the invasion of a sovereign nation as well as rapidly accelerating climate change.
Thanks, Russia.
You're welcome. Oops.
Loquacious.
No.
Casserole.
No.
This episode of Map Men is brought to you by Stereo.
Peru next to Australia.
Mozambique joined to India.
Malaysia in Antarctica.
Today we'll be asking, where will the countries be in 250 million years?
Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map Men, Map Men, Map, Map, Map Men, Men.
When Mark and I hang out together, one of the things we often discuss...
We never hang out, this is a purely business relationship.
One of the things we would discuss is how disappointingly few double landlocked countries there are. Countries that are not only landlocked, but surrounded by landlocked countries.
There's Uzbekistan, there's Liechtenstein, and that's it.
This is because the world's major landmasses are nicely spread out across the world's oceans, and the furthest you can ever get from a coastline is just 1,600 miles, here in the un-Chinese-sounding Gurban-Tungut Desert in China.
But the continents haven't always been this well socially distanced.
180 million years ago, before the Second and First World Wars, the world looked like this.
Of course, the dinosaurs who were in charge at the time knew nothing of the theory of plate tectonics that were about to drive them apart.
It wasn't until the year 1915 collided with the person Alfred Wegener that this new and groundbreaking idea took hold. Alfred was a super smart German meteorologist and geophysicist who was particularly good at puzzles. And looking at the world map, Alfred spotted a pattern. The shape of South America fits suspiciously snugly into West Africa. Could it be that the continents fitted together in a sort of puzzle of their own?
Many of the pieces of this puzzle were missing, having been eroded over millions of years. But Alfred realised this particular puzzle had legacy written all over it and set out to prove that their interlocking shapes weren't a coincidence.
He started by looking at rocks and realised that the rocks on the east coast of South America were, in many places, identical to the rocks on the west coast of Africa. An encouraging bit of evidence, but rocks alone weren't solid enough. So next, Alfred studied the fossil record.
There was evidence of the exact same species of dinosaur living on separate continents, vast oceans apart. He found fossils of the Lystrosaurus in Africa, Antarctica, and here in India.
It was thunderingly unlikely that this unique Triassic animal could have evolved on 3 separate occasions. The more logical explanation was that these landmasses must once have been connected.
Thunderingly?
Using his new theory called continental drift, or Kontinentalverschiebung for long, Wegener mapped exactly how the continents fitted together millions of years ago.
He called this supercontinent Pangaea,
Greek for all the earth.
The theory went thus.
North and South America were once attached to modern-day Africa, but they broke apart, forming the Atlantic Ocean.
And India was once attached to Antarctica, but it broke off and smashed into Asia with such force it made the Himalayan mountain range. Everyone else at the time roundly disagreed with him, as at the time people always do. He froze to death in Greenland before anyone took his stupid theory seriously.
But, years later, while he was still dead,
Scientists happened upon something that proved Alfred was right. They discovered how continents were able to move, something Alfred had never bothered to work out. They found that convection currents in the mantle, or hot bit beneath the Earth's crust, slowly drive landmasses apart, then back together again, over cycles of about 500 million years.
This meant that Pangaea, far from being the original supercontinent, was actually the 11th to have formed in Earth's history.
So if the continents are still moving, which they are, the obvious and exciting question becomes...
When are the dinosaurs coming back?
Where are the continents going next?
The best way of understanding where we might end up is to take a good look at which way the convection currents are currently flowing all under the world.
And where better to start than the most tectonically active place on the planet?
the Australia plate has, as you can see, moved northwards a massive 3.5 metres in the last 50 years. At 7 centimetres a year, this makes it the fastest moving tectonic plate on Earth.
Whew. This movement is actually causing chaos on GPS systems here in Australia. The data points still used today were fixed way back in 1994, when the country was a full 1.8 metres further southwest than it is now, which can be the difference between the right lane and the pavement.
The effects of Australia's movement are already being felt across fiery Indonesia, where the subduction of the Australia plate under the Sunda plate has forged some of the most active volcanoes in the world, like Mount Merapi, which some of the best people in the world are known to have climbed. As Australia continues north, it's expected to make a handbrake turn to the left as it gobbles up Papua New Guinea before absolutely smashing into China. So Beijing and Shanghai may find themselves 8,000 metres up on top of a new mountain range as big as the Himalayas.
Meanwhile, in the Western Hemisphere, the Nubian and Somali plates will split apart along the East African Rift Valley, a process which has already begun, as demonstrated by this massive crack which appeared in Kenya in 2018. Over the next few million years, we can expect a new sea to appear here. The big bit of Africa will continue to head north towards Europe, so get ready for the Alps to get bigger and the Mediterranean to disappear.
Somewhere between 1 and 200 million years from now, and yes, that really is the kind of margin for error we're dealing with, Antarctica will slowly make its way to join the big collision party alongside Australia and Southeast Asia.
Leaving only the Americas, which are travelling in a westerly direction, widening the Atlantic and shrinking the Pacific into non-existence. You can see North America here, nicely spooning Australia, with South America cozying up to now tropical Antarctica, finishing off our big continental group hug.
Aw, isn't that nice?
Scientists call this future supercontinent Novo Pangaea.
Latin and Greek for New All the Earth.
Imagine that, one happy connected island with no oceans to divide us. But how sure can we be that this is exactly how it's going to pan out?
Positively unsure. Even with all the data and powerful computer modelling in the world, there's a decent chance the experts have got it wrong.
Novo Pangaea is merely what would happen if the convection currents in the mantle carry on exactly as they are and don't change. But some really radical scientists have come up with some different models for how the world could look.
First there's Aurica, or Aurica, where Eurasia splits in half and both the Pacific and Atlantic Oceans close up.
Then there's Pangaea Ultima, the name which sounds most like a terrible Bond film, where Britain gets closer to America.
And finally there's Amasia, where all the continents congregate around the North Pole, except Antarctica, who, no matter what the model is always the laziest continent. Watching the world's land masses slowly cycle around the globe as millions of years tick by is a nice reminder of our own utterly insignificant place within the universe.
Which is why we recommend sharing this video with any self-important friends you may have as a way of reminding them how crushingly unimportant they really are.
Of course, wondering where countries will be in 250 million years assumes countries and even humans will last that long. Right now, it seems the chances of us surviving more than a few metres of continental drift are incredibly unlikely, as we grapple with overpopulation, climate change, pandemics, wars, pollution and mass extinction.
But if we do somehow survive and find ourselves living side by side on a supercontinent packed with double landlocked countries, we're at least going to have to figure out how to be nicer to one another and extend the olive branch of human friendship.
So, fancy a pint?
I'm not really thirsty. Oh, good. It's time for my favourite part of Map Men, the silly advert at the end.
Hello, everyone.
Today we're asking, who does Antarctica belong to?
Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men.
And here's
I'll do it properly.
And here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men.
Antarctica is the continent you know least about.
When it does have the decency to appear on maps, it tends to be shown as a crinkly white stripe across the bottom.
Or, for those watching in Mercator projection, a massive splodge of white, twice the size of the rest of the world's landmass combined. So little thought is given to what shape it really, or how big it really, is.
Here on a round Earth is what Antarctica really looks like from below. Deciding which way up this map should be is difficult since every direction is north, but most maps have been standardised this way, with 0 degrees longitude going straight up from the South Pole.
During the winter, the sun doesn't rise for 4 months, and temperatures reach the dizzying lows of minus 60 degrees Celsius, which is the same as minus 60 degrees centigrade.
Surprisingly, it doesn't actually snow a lot. Antarctica is one of the driest places on Earth, and technically the world's largest desert, as well as looking like the world's largest dessert.
It's covered in a 4-kilometre thick sheet of ice, littered with perfectly preserved corpses of generations of dead penguins.
Sounds like an awful place.
It is, but that hasn't stopped people from trying to own it. In the late 19th century, Antarctica was the last bit of the world map yet to be properly filled in. Dozens of brave explorers from Britain, Norway, France and various other seafaring countries all set out for the South Pole in a bid for fame, glory, fortune and prizes.
And the winners were Norwegians Roald Amundsen and his crew, who, surviving the blistering cold by eating their own dogs, became the first humans ever to reach the South Pole on December 14, 1911.
They then spent 3 further freezing cold days taking celestial measurements just to make sure they were in the right spot.
Good. I was right. Let's go.
Today, British schoolchildren learn about Amundsen as a small footnote in the story of the much braver British Captain Scott, who reached the pole 33 days after those naughty Norwegians, but at least had the decency to die before he made it home.
Even though Amundsen had done the South Pole, the race to own Antarctica was only just hotting up. Owning more land increased your chances of finding valuable things like gold, zinc and uranium, which Antarctica had lots of.
And so Norway, France and especially Britain claimed they owned the bits of coastline where their early explorers had planted flags.
With no locals to say otherwise, these claims stretched all the way to the South Pole like Trivial Pursuit wedges. Apart from Norway, who, content with being the first to reach the pole, were content with not pretending to own it.
Faced with a blank canvas, colonists were allowed to be as inventive as they liked in coming up with the names for their new Antarctic colonies.
Queen Mary Land, King Edward VII Plateau, Princess Elizabeth Land, Queen Maud Land, Graham Land.
But British domination wouldn't last. When Australia and New Zealand got their independence, they also inherited the wedges nearest their coastline that they'd been taking care of for the British, and they've continued to hold on to them since.
At one point, a small portion of Antarctica was claimed by Nazi Germany, who in 1939 flew over dropping massive darts with swastikas on them. Historians today consider this to be in the top 10 least important things to happen during World War II.
Perhaps the oddest claims come from Chile and Argentina, who in the middle of the 20th century suddenly remembered that they already owned Antarctica before it was even discovered.
In the 1400s, when Spain and Portugal were colonising South America, they made a deal to split the continent between them in a dead straight vertical line.
And because South America hadn't been fully explored in those days, the deal made no mention of where the line stopped.
Centuries later, with Antarctica now discovered, the ex-Spanish colonies of Argentina and Chile politely suggested that the line might end at the South Pole, meaning these bits of Antarctica would technically belong to them, specifically the bits directly south of their own borders, which meant their claims slightly overlapped each other's and massively overlapped Britain's.
The only wedge of Antarctica not claimed by any nation was this section here, Marie Byrd Land, remote and hard to get to even by Antarctican standards, making it the largest expanse of land on the planet not claimed by anyone.
And that's how we got to this colourful cartographic confusion today.
Overlapping territory, rival disputes, exactly what sort of exciting dramatic consequences did this have?
None.
Good.
Britain didn't seem to mind overlapping territory with Chile and or Argentina. It simply ignored them and continued pretending to own the place. Chile and Argentina returned the favour by simply ignoring Britain.
This was all fine and hilarious, and none of it mattered, until...
It's the Cold War. Almost every conflict around the world is in some way related to the ongoing personality clash of the two great superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. So if you live on a large, remote, disputed landmass, you might want to prepare yourself for some nuclear weapons testing.
Because the mood on the international stage was all the countries involved and several more countries who weren't involved felt that in order to keep hypothetically peaceful Antarctica actually peaceful, they might have to, at the very least, hold a meeting.
In 1959, they all signed a big piece of paper called the Antarctic Treaty.
Antarctica is the common heritage of all mankind. It should be perfectly and peacefully preserved for future generations, literally forever. Oh, yes.
So, will you all give up your territories? So they came up with a compromise. All nations who already had colonies on Antarctica could keep them, as long as they never expanded or changed them, and no one was allowed to make any new ones, which meant the map was effectively frozen. Two countries to whom this rule did not apply, by the way, were the USA and USSR, who uniquely were, and still are, allowed to make their own new territorial claims on Antarctica if they ever fancy it. Because, you know, big.
In return for being able to hold on to their claims, all the countries agreed to the following rules.
No mining, no military, no nuclear waste, no explosions, no heavy petting.
This meant that countries technically could still own the place, but they weren't allowed to do anything that made it look like they owned the place. They both owned it and didn't own it.
Clever. The Antarctic Treaty is still upheld today, and as a result of its success, it's the world's largest nature reserve. A vast, stunningly beautiful, totally unspoiled wilderness.
Apart from the more than 3,000 scientists in hundreds of research stations from every country you can think of.
And more than 44,000 tourists a year.
Tourism in Antarctica is now more popular than ever as big, huge, polluting cruise liners arrive for people to gawp at the ice sheets.
Everyone is asked to leave Antarctica exactly as they found it, which means everyone's favourite Antarctica fact, you have to take your poo home with you.
You don't want to look in those.
But perhaps the biggest threat to Antarctica is climate change. In the last decade, Antarctic ice melt has led to over 4 millimeters of global sea level rise, resulting in catastrophic consequences across the blah 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 blah.
The precious Antarctic Treaty will expire in 2048, which sounds like ages away, but actually gets closer every 5 minutes.
Depending on what sort of leaders are in charge or what mood the international community is in, the treaty could end up being scrapped in favour of expensive ice hotels.
Or quad bike racing tracks.
Or a Southern Lights themed music festival.
Or huge movie sets for movies set in the Antarctic.
Or perhaps just good old-fashioned resource exploitation and all-out war.
Either way, the human race is going to have to decide what kind of future it envisages for cold, white, barren, faraway territories held together by fragile treaties.
Because Antarctica isn't the only one that's worried.
Mark!
Yes, Jay?
I've completed Netflix!
What?
There's nothing else to watch on TV!
You mean you've watched every single show on UK Netflix?
Yeah, it took me ages!
Well, why don't you have a look and see what's on American Netflix?
Because we're not in America?
But you can use Surfshark!
What's Surfshark?
Surfshark? Someone's emailed us asking which country's shape is most like a square.
What a stupid question.
Totally pointless. Slovakia?
No.
Georgia?
No. Bangladesh?
No, Bangladesh looks like a wizard.
You think everything looks like a wizard. Ghana?
Too long.
North Macedonia?
Too round.
Liberia?
No.
Malaysia?
Jay, Malaysia is not a square.
But there must be one somewhere.
Not in Oman or the UAE. And Yemen's more a rectangle.
Yes, I can see.
Russia's nothing like a square.
Too long, as far as I'm aware. Mali starts off strongly, but right here it goes to pot.
Burkina Faso is irregular. Four-sided, it is not.
Italy's a boot.
And so is Papua New Guinea.
What about Benin and Togo?
No, they're both far too skinny.
What about these little countries? Costa Rica, Lebanon?
There's no square in Singapore, Brunei, Mauritius or Gabon.
Kuwait looks like a little thumb. Madagascar looks quite lean.
Burundi looks quite like a heart. Qatar looks like a bean.
India's a diamond and Slovenia's a splot.
Cuba's very long and thin and both Koreas are short and squat.
Mozambique has got too many sides, Uzbekistan as well. Little Paraguay's no paradigm, Mauritania's an L.
And Malawi's like a seahorse, Guinea-Bissau's a weathered rock. And Nauru's nearly a circle and Somalia's a sock.
France is famously a hexagon, that fact is quite well known. But it's not the only one, it's joined by Sierra Leone.
What about these landlocked countries like Nepal or South Sudan?
They're not square and nor are Denmark, Finland, China or Iran.
Luxembourgers are all squares, which their borders don't reflect. And Australia's a cat dog and Japan we must reject.
Guatemala has two squarish sides in this bit in the north, but it won't meet our criteria cause it needs a third and fourth.
Timor-Leste
doesn't pass the test.
Moldova, Guinea.
Don't be silly.
Little Rwanda
Doesn't stand a hope in hell.
Nor does Israel.
Are we seriously going to go through every country?
Yes, I think it's important.
Both the USA and Canada have squares in large amounts, but we're only counting countries and states don't count.
Poland would look like a square if it invaded to the south. Kazakhstan looks like a turtle with a leaf stuck in its mouth.
Despite a square's efficiency, the Germans don't come close.
And Peru is like a resting dog, Guyana's like a ghost.
Ethiopia and Switzerland look like potato wedges.
Norway, Sweden and New Zealand all have far too crinkly edges.
If you have a lot of coastline, then your sides will not be straight, so the squareness of the Philippines, Greece and Ireland would be great.
Tajikistan's quite funky, as is elephant head-shaped island. There's no square in Indonesia's 18,000 tiny islands.
If your country's made of islands, then a square you'll never be. There are loads of island nations that are mostly MTC.
Trinidad and Tobago, St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the Solomon Islands, the Seychelles, the Maldives, Micronesia, Fiji, the Marshall Islands, St. Kitts and Nevis, Sao Tome and Principe, the Bahamas, Cape Verde, Tonga, Vanuatu.
The Netherlands is flat, although its edges do not fit. And the following are countries with a sticky outy bit. There's Afghanistan, Namibia, the DRC's got two.
There's Ukraine, Venezuela, Eritrea, Cyprus and Kosovo.
Is Morocco square?
No, it's more austere.
Kiribati?
Not square, alas.
Senegal?
Not square at all.
San Marino?
San Marino.
The CAR, so near, so far. Botswana's like a flounder.
Chad looks like Jay Leno. Eswatini couldn't be rounder.
Mongolia looks like a bat. The Congo's kind of foxy.
Myanmar's like a genie and not even slightly boxy. Belize has one edge here that's straight, but this bit's rather lumpy.
Algeria and Kenya are pentagons. Honduras is too bumpy.
Sri Lanka's like a raindrop. Kyrgyzstan's a bird in flight.
While Iraq and Jordan's lines are straight, the angles just aren't right. Colombia's kind of squarish, though its borders are quite rough. And Iberia would pass, but Spain alone's not square enough.
If Bolivia expanded, then a square it just might be. Nicaragua would look square if you viewed it in 3D.
Little Liechtenstein and the Argentines are not square in the least.
The Dominican Republic, that just tapers to the east. Lesotho sort of squarish, but the angle's on the wonk.
Cameroon is like a chicken with a huge badonkadonk.
Mexico?
No.
Portugal?
Too thin, too tall.
The Saudis?
Too much on a slant.
The Vatican?
The Vatican.
Listing every country by its shape is not an easy job, when inevitably loads of them look only like a blob.
So to make things more efficient, as I'm sure you've got the gist, here are all the blobby countries in a quick compiled list.
Andorra, Antigua and Barbuda, Austria, Barbados, Belgium, Belarus, Bhutan, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Cambodia, Czechia, Djibouti, Dominica, Estonia, Grenada, Hungary, Iceland, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Serbia, St. Lucia, Tanzania, Uruguay, Zimbabwe.
Sama's like a butterfly whose wings have been removed.
But at Ecuador and Bahrain, and it's massively improved.
Little Monaco's so tiny you can see the piers within.
Chile's very, 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 very long and thin.
Uganda cannot be a square because of all the lakes. The Gambia, Vietnam and Panama all look like snakes.
Haiti, Croatia and Zambia all have shapes that wrap around. Syria's just a bit too slopey and El Salvador's too long.
That doesn't rhyme.
Palau looks like a jellyfish, Pakistan looks like a duck.
Azerbaijan looks like a bird that's been run over by a truck.
This monkey is Armenian.
This shooting star's Laotian.
Jamaica, Malta and Niger are creatures from the ocean.
Greenland's not a real country even though it's really big.
The UK looks like an old witch sitting sideways on a pig.
Comoros would if it were glued.
Some parts of Tuvalu look rude.
Turkmenistan looks like something or another.
Tunisia and Albania look like each other.
South Africa's too wobbly, Bulgaria's too knobbly, Brazil is too triangular, Turkey is too rectangular. Now the only countries left are ones whose squareness are the best.
If you know which ones are coming, we're incredibly impressed.
Little Montenegro square if you rotate it some degrees.
South Sudan has left behind a very square North Sudanese.
The angles in Angola mean it's nearly good to go. And Nigeria comes close although it bulges down below.
Libya is nearly square, it's more a parallelogram.
And Cote d'Ivoire and Suriname do well in our exam.
Equatorial Guinea's very square, but unfortunately, since its capital's on an island, then the squarest it can't be. So the winner of our contest, fitting all our tight prescriptions,
it's the squarest of the squarest.
The nation of the pharaohs,
the land of Cleopatra,
the country where the Sphinx is, it's the land of the Egyptians.
Any more interesting emails come in?
There's one asking for every capital city in the world.
Oh, that would have made a much better song.
Next on the day.
America.
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 Americas.
Americans.
Americanos.
American.
Americano.
A merry-go-round.
Amerigo Vespucci.
An Italian.
Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map Men, Map Men, Map, Map, Map Men, Men.
The United States of America is a 5-word country.
States, United, the and of are all self-explanatory, but the America part makes a lot less sense than you might think.
As we all know, America was discovered by Christopher Columbus in 1492.
And discovered is the right word because there definitely weren't people living there already.
And it was definitely him who discovered it, not the Chinese in 1421 or the Vikings around the year 1000.
The China theory is heavily debated.
And it was definitely the United States of America he discovered in 1492, not some Caribbean islands.
Good to be clear.
But although Columbus had reached a new world, he never reached the realisation he'd reached it.
He'd set out in search of an alternative route to the spices of the East Indies and wrongly thought he'd found one.
And so he named the Caribbean islands the West Indies because he'd sailed west to find them. Which is weird because if he thought about it and he had actually gone around the world and hit the East Indies, he'd have hit them on the east side, so he probably should have called them the East Indies. So if he had been right, the West Indies would today be on the eastern side of the Indies, which is ridiculous.
But Columbus wasn't the only European who'd had a 15th century midlife crisis that involved buying a massive boat and sailing west until he'd come to terms with his own mortality.
Just 1 year after Columbus first reached the South American mainland, Italian explorer Amerigo Vespucci got there second. But the crucial difference between Vespucci and Chris, as people in the voyaging business referred to him, is Vespucci did know he'd reached a brand new continent, and word soon spread of an exciting new world.
Hear ye, hear ye! There's a brand new continent we knew nothing about until now, full of gold and spices and exciting new vegetables!
Mapmakers around the world set to work creating new and up-to-date world maps, each with their own dreadful renderings of the increasingly but still not very discovered continent.
One of these mapmakers was a German called Martin Waldseemüller, who in 1507 had all but finished his magnificent new world map, except for one small detail: what to name the new continent everyone was talking about.
He very likely would have named it Columbia, after the widely agreed discoverer of the New World, Columbus. But Amerigo Vespucci had some very clever PR people who were falsifying documents and spreading lies about exactly when he'd reached the New World.
And these lies must have reached the ears of Martin Waldseemüller.
You're listening to the Vespucci Hour on Explorer FM. Amerigo, he got there first.
Because he made the fateful decision to label the new continent America.
Latin for Amerigo.
Waldseemüller published his map complete with an unnecessarily long Latin title.
Complete map following of Ptolemy, the tradition, and of Amerigo Vespucci, of others, also the illustrations.
If you zoom into his map and look carefully, you can see the little word America in what we now call modern-day Brazil. It was the first time that made-up word had been used anywhere by anyone ever.
Nobody knows why Martin named it after Amerigo's fairly common first name rather than the Vespucci part. It's a bit like if I discovered a continent and they named it Markland instead of the more enticing-sounding Cooper World Jonesania.
One part of the New World that Martin clearly didn't give much thought to was this bit up here, which he drew super small and super inaccurate.
So it may surprise you to learn the inhabitants of this area were the people who, centuries later, cared the most about this map.
Fast forward 500 years to the 90s.
Throughout the 90s, the United States tried desperately to get their hands on Waldseemüller's map.
Because it contained the first use of the word America, the US considered it to be their birth certificate, not minding that it had actually been given to a different baby since they had no qualms about swapping babies even though they were now grown adults.
At the time, Waldseemüller's map was sitting in a drawer in the private collection of Prince Johannes zu Waldburg-Wulfegg und Waldsee in Germany.
They wanted it so much they paid $10 million for it, making Waldseemüller's map by far the most expensive map in history.
In 2007, the map finally earned its wrongful place on display in the United States Library of Congress. How a library was able to raise $10 million, we can only guess.
So how come America got to name itself America? You'd think that writing the Latin word America on Latin America would mean America should describe Latin America. So why is non-Latin USA allowed its A at all?
Part of the reason is that they achieved independence before any of the other 34 American countries.
In 1776, the 13 colonies that had been known as British America used their rifles to shotgun the name the United States of America.
Over time, the long name the United States of America got shortened to just America, which is how the English-speaking world almost exclusively refers to the United States today.
And as you might expect, or if you're an American, as you might never have given any thought to, this annoys a lot of people.
Whom does it annoy?
First, Latin America. In the Spanish-speaking world, the word America on its own always refers to the entire continent, and never the country, which they call
Los Estados Unidos.
They even set up a petition demanding Los Estados stop stealing their name and get a new one right now.
With 308 signatures, it's surely only a matter of time before America concedes.
Second, Canada. Canadians resent the USA arrogantly naming itself after their shared continent, but not as much as they resent being mistaken for Americans by people who can't tell their accents apart and confuse them with people who serve cheese out of a spray can.
Third, British people. Couldn't they just keep calling it British America? It had such a nice ring to it, if you're British.
Fourth, Chris Columbus. If the Americans do insist on naming their continent after a European explorer, Columbus, lest we forget, was actually there before Amerigo Vespucci. As it is, Columbus had to settle
for the US capital, a province of Canada, another country, countless other towns and cities, and a national holiday. Poor guy.
And lastly, Amerigo Vespucci himself, who died never knowing these new lands were to bear his name in so many confusing and overlapping ways.
So, if the United States of Americans did want to change their name, what on earth could they change it to? Any attempt at a rebrand would come with its own controversy, and, of course, it's hard to imagine patriotic Americans ever actually voting to be called anything else.
Even though it appears that the US Library of Congress spent $10 million on a map that suggests its country gave itself the wrong name, it looks like the USA of America will go on calling itself America for many years to come.
Classic America.
Oh, hi.
The word country can be hard to pin down. It can be nation state, the outdoors, or a genre of music.
But how does a country become a country? In today's programme, we'll look at what it takes to change the world map.
Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men,
and here's the map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men.
The world map is reassuringly solid, with clear, thick black lines to let you know what's one thing and what's not that one thing.
It appears so fixed, people are willing to get it tattooed onto their skin, presumably so they can then colour in the countries they visit to show everyone how cultured and worldly and annoying they are.
But of course, the world map does change as new countries spring into existence.
The most recent examples include Timor-Leste in 2002, Montenegro in 2006, and South Sudan in 2011. The good news is, anybody can claim a country. All you have to do is say, "This is mine." The bad news is getting the rest of the world to agree with you is mega hard.
We're going to have a look at what separates those who have been successful from those that have been not, or unsuccessful.
And few people have been more not successful than Englishman Stuart Hill, who in February 2011 founded the country of Forvik. Stuart Hill's story begins during a failed attempt to circumnavigate Great Britain in a rowing boat with a windsail stuck in it.
After 8 expensive rescue call-outs, Stuart wound up in hospital in the Shetland Islands, from where he soon discovered the tiny uninhabited island of Forvik.
Stuart liked Forvik so much, he set his sights on being the supreme ruler of it.
After doing lots of careful reading into the history of the Shetland Islands, he summarised what he read into a dubious argument that they were technically still part of the Old Norse Empire, not Scotland, and therefore Forvik was free to claim. First Minister?
Stuart Hill.
Population?
Stuart Hill.
Name?
Stuart Hill.
Stuart was so convinced of Forvik's sovereignty, he refused to pay vehicle tax and was sent to prison. Stuart issued a statement saying,
"I'm right and they're wrong."
Stuart Hill. Although his country has a flag and a website, Forvik remains part of Scotland on all world maps.
Except those drawn by Stuart. So how do you go about creating a new country that appears on everyone else's world maps?
The thing you need to get most maps to give you a thick black outline is a seat at the United Nations, the international body that agrees international things.
But how do you get that seat? Whose email address do you need? Should you sign off yours sincerely or yours faithfully, and will that make the difference?
The UN have a strict set of requirements all applicants have to meet in order to be considered. The first of which is...
Do you have a historical connection to the land?
Is this where Stuart, an Englishman claiming part of Scotland, went wrong? What if Stuart's family had lived on Forvik for thousands of years? Is an ancestral link enough to convince the UN you're a country? Let's look at an example that answers that very question.
The Black Hills of northern USA have been the ancestral lands of the Lakota Native Americans for centuries, and in 1868, the US government recognised this in a treaty that promised the land to the Lakota forever. But forever did not, it turned out, mean until we find gold, which happened shortly after.
The Lakota were offered compensation of $500 million for the stolen territory, but they've always refused the money, insisting their ancestral lands are not for sale.
In 2007, the Lakota of Dakota declared an independent nation of Lakota, breaking away from the United States, taking with them the giant faces of 4 American presidents in a mountain.
With the legal treaty providing indisputable evidence that the Lakota technically owned the land, surely the UN would make good straight away and confirm a shiny new country.
Unfortunately for them, their coloniser also happened to be the richest country in the world, with enormous influence on what does and doesn't get ratified.
America looked at their proposal, thought very hard, and said no.
And absolutely nobody was surprised.
Hard evidence in the form of clear documentation wasn't enough to get independence. But consider this example from the other side of the planet, a claim to independence based on a lack of documentation.
The Murrawari Aborigines have never accepted that their land officially belongs to Australia. Nobody ever signed a treaty with them, beat them in a war, or even so much as set foot in their territory when Australia was founded.
In March 2013, the Murrawari wrote a letter to the Prime Minister of Australia and the Queen of England, head of state in Australia, long story, asking to see documents proving that Australia were their rightful owners.
After 21 days, the Murrawari decided to interpret the ensuing silence as recognition. In March 2013, they formally declared the continuance of their statehood and asked the UN to recognise a new country twice the size of Denmark.
But without any real geopolitical power behind them, the UN just loudly ignored their declaration, to this day leaving Australia in charge of collecting Murrawari bins.
So sometimes you need to do more than politely submit a proposal. The UN might also consider...
Have you fought any lengthy or bloody civil wars?
If you want to make the UN really sit up and pay attention, you need what's creepily referred to as a monopoly over violence, or total military control.
This can be a surefire route to recognition. Examples include Bangladesh, Venezuela, the USA, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, India, Pakistan, Algeria, Latvia, Namibia and Portugal, to name but 12.
A more recent and more ongoing example can be found in East Africa.
When ex-British Somaliland got independence in the 60s, they joined with their ex-Italian neighbours to become one happy Horn of African country.
This happiness quickly became unhappiness under a brutal dictatorship, and, following a devastating civil war, Somaliland once again declared independence in 1991. Today, Somaliland have their own separate military, passports, even currency.
Somaliland sent a request to the UN asking for their seal of approval, but despite fitting all the criteria for becoming a new country, the UN still hasn't lifted a finger. It doesn't help that other African nations refuse to acknowledge Somaliland's independence. Countries like Mali and Morocco, with separatist movements of their own, are terrified of an independence domino effect.
So Somaliland remains in limbo as an autonomous region of Somalia. Despite its clearly enforced border, Google Maps doesn't even bother with a dotted line, let alone a solid one.
Why is it so hard to get the attention of the UN? How come Somaliland didn't manage it, but South Sudan did?
South Sudan successfully became the world's newest proper recognised by the UN country in July 2011. Exactly like Somaliland, they had a historical claim to their land, fought a civil war, and were just as politically obscure in the eyes of the world's richest countries. So what was that final missing piece that made the UN pay attention?
Hello, I'm George Clooney, and I think South Sudan should be a new country.
That's why.
Hollywood humanitarian George Clooney has been raising awareness about the plight of the Sudanese ever since the Darfur conflict in the mid-2000s.
Nobody cares about Sudan.
I said I'm George Clooney, and I can make people care about South Sudan because I say I care. I mean, because I do care. I'm not acting now, this is real.
Damn it. Oh my god, you are George Clooney, winner of an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor. Sudan in 2, you say? Consider it done.
I'm a hero!
And therein lies the lesson for Stuart Hill. What he should have done was get Reese Witherspoon to do a tweet about Forvik's cruel subjugation by the British, and he just might have got somewhere.
Around the world, there are but dozens more examples of are they or aren't they countries.
Many behave exactly like countries, with passports, governments and currencies, and whilst not having a comfy chair at the United Nations, do still feature on the maps of their political allies, Palestine, Taiwan and Kosovo, to name but 2.5.
Despite the UN being a very popular method by which to judge the countryness of a country, at the end of the day, there's no such thing as official. The world map looks different depending on which country you're looking at it in, and countryness will always be a grey area.
Does that mean I can declare my half of the desk an independent country?
Yes, but I'd only invade.
And I deserve it.
Jay, hi.
Where have you been? It's 2:04.
When you look at the world map, it's immediately obvious how many continents there are and which countries belong to which ones.
No, it isn't.
That's right, that's why we're doing an episode about it. Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map, map, men, map, map, men, map, 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 men, men.
All British primary schools rated at least satisfactory by Ofsted will teach their children that there are 7 continents.
Europe, Asia, Africa, Australia, Antarctica, North America and South America.
But other countries' curriculums beg to differ. In parts of Europe, they teach just 6 continents.
In Russia and Japan, they teach a different 6 continents.
And in South America, they teach just 5 continents.
So who should we believe?
Whom should we believe?
Exactly.
The most common definition of a continent is a large continuous landmass separated by oceans.
I like that definition. It's exactly how I imagine a continent.
Good for you, Mark. Now take a look at a world map and tell me how many large continuous landmasses are separated by ocean.
Great. Australia?
1.
North America?
It's attached to South America.
But the Panama Canal
is man-made and definitely not an ocean.
Point taken. So, all of America?
2.
Antarctica?
3.
Africa?
Africa is only separated from Eurasia by another man-made canal, the Suez, so it doesn't fit the definition.
I see. So, Afro-Eurasia?
Congratulations!
So, according to the most common definition, there should only be 4 continents.
Also, the largest of these, Afro-Eurasia, contains 86% of the world's population, making it a useless distinction.
I don't like this definition anymore.
Neither do I. So, can we instead use another, more sciencey definition?
We can. The reason the Earth's land masses are as spread out as they are is because the tectonic plates that make up the Earth's crust have moved them apart over time, and using the major tectonic plates as our guide to the continents, we get a more even distribution of where they are.
Tectonically speaking, North America is separate from South America, Africa is separate from Eurasia, and Antarctica and Australia are separate from everything. Nice and simple.
But on closer inspection, this tectonic definition also has some major issues.
For example, Australia. The country of Australia is this bit.
But the tectonic plate, also called Australia, includes Australia and a bit of New Zealand, and half of the island of Papua, which includes both Papua New Guinea and the province of Papua, which is in Indonesia, which is in Asia.
Which is confusing. So, to avoid this country-continent muddle, other names for this continent do exist, including Sahul, Meganesia and Australinia.
Not to be confused with Australasia, an increasingly unfashionable term describing Australia and New Zealand and some but not all of the Pacific Islands, so we're not going to mention it again.
So then, what continent does New Zealand belong to? By both our definitions so far, none.
Good for New Zealand. What's wrong with not belonging to any continent?
Not being able to take part in the Olympics.
Because this famous 4-yearly competition to see who can host the best fireworks display is open to every country in the world, its 5 continental rings must somehow include them all.
Each ring represents a different continent. There's Europe, America, Africa, Asia.
And this one represents a broad region including Australia, New Zealand, as well as the Micro-Mela and Polynesian countries known as Oceania.
Oceania, its very name meaning the opposite of continent, is not considered one by any strict definition, but it's a popular term, especially for the purpose of making sure no country misses out on being incontinent. Only Antarctica doesn't get an Olympic ring because it's too cold to host a fireworks display.
No.
The tectonic and Olympic approaches could be easily combined, including both Antarctica and Oceania, giving us a nice problem-free 6 continents.
Except it's not problem-free at all. We need to talk about Europe.
Whether part of a landmass or a tectonic plate, Europe appears to be nothing more than a glorified Asian peninsula. So, what actually is Europe?
Can it really be possible that the home of the continental breakfast isn't even a continent at all? And if so, what do we call that breakfast other than disappointing?
Which brings us to a third element to consider in the definition of a continent: culture. Knowing which continent a country's in immediately tells you something about what it's like.
And because Norway has more in common with Sweden when it comes to language, religion, ethnicity and favourite cutlery than it does with, say, Vietnam, a line is helpfully drawn here, breaking Eurasia up into 2 bits.
But complicated culture can't be conveniently cut into clear categories.
Some countries cause tremendous headaches for this dividing line.
First, Armenia.
A country which, with a 95% Christian population, arguably falls in the Europe category, but geographically belongs to Asia. And speaking as someone who's a 32nd Armenian, where do you think these eyebrows come from, I can confirm I have no idea what continent it should be in.
The second problem country is Turkey, which incessantly prides itself on being an Asian-European hybrid.
Food?
Asia.
Trading partners?
Europe.
Religion?
Asia.
Writing system?
Europe.
This leaves the dividing line with no option but to split Turkey's largest city, Istanbul, straight down the middle, misleadingly suggesting that the populations either side of the Straits of Bosphorus are somehow totally different from one another.
One way of solving the problem of where the line goes is to insist that it doesn't exist.
Which is the approach taken by Russia.
Which should come as no surprise, because it's in Russia's interest to view Eurasia as a single continent.
If it's divided, that might make people think they're different from each other.
And when people think they're different, they like to talk about things like independence.
To make matters messier, some European countries have significant territories in other continents. The largest part of Denmark is officially in North America.
And France, with dozens of overseas territories, has put bits of Europe in Africa, Oceania, both Americas and Antarctica.
Perhaps the best example of the difficulty of pinning down what is and isn't Europe can be found in the insufferable Eurovision Song Contest.
Insufferably fabulous?
In its first year, just 7 very European countries took to the stage: Belgium, France, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Switzerland and West Germany.
But with more countries wanting to get in on the pop-tastic action, this quickly expanded, adding transcontinental Russia, dubiously European Georgia, Asia's Israel, Africa's Morocco, eventually giving up the geographical facade altogether with Australia's Australia.
What Eurovision demonstrates quite well is that continents are all about politics.
Every continent now has some form of political and economic union. There's Mercosur, the African Union, ASEAN, and of course the EU.
But these organisations are rarely drawn on the same lines as the continents themselves. Despite the number of people who confused Britain leaving the EU with Britain leaving Europe, it remains something which, tectonically speaking, we can't actually have a referendum on. The underlying question in all of this is, why does it matter how many continents there are? Should we even care which one we belong to?
Well, no, not really. What the continents really represent is a human desire to use broad generalisations to categorise the world into arbitrary subdivisions.
So whether it's 7, 5 or even 6 continents, these subdivisions will remain as useful as they are argued about.
Are you really a 32nd Armenian?
Yes.
Because I'm a 23rd Hawaiian.
Are you really?
No.
Hello.
Bonjour.
With travel restrictions coming to an end, we'll soon be allowed to go on holiday again.
Les restrictions pour voyager sont bientôt terminées. Nous allons pouvoir enfin partir en vacances.
So there's never been a better time to brush up on a foreign language.
Marc ne parle pas français, alors je peux dire ce que je veux.
Coordinates. What's the use in a map without them?
There are thousands.
Possibly more.
But for navigating seamen, they were critical.
This is the story of how one man overcame the odds to solve one of the world's greatest riddles.
Welcome to Map Men.
We're the men.
And here's the map.
Map Men, Map Men, Map.
Ah, yes. Sorry, this isn't a map.
It's a clock.
It's a clock. But it's a map thing.
Mapping men, mapping men, map, map, mapping thing, men, thing.
Longitude and latitude are the grid lines that encircle the Earth.
The lines of latitude run from side to side, telling you how far north or south you are in the world.
And the lines of longitude do exactly the same thing, but the opposite.
For sailors sailing the seas, to know where you are, you absolutely have to know both.
Calculating latitude has always been easy. In the olden days, all sailors had to do was look at the sun and then, depending how high it was in the sky, measure the angle to work out the latitude somehow. The point is, it wasn't a problem.
Longitude, however, was a big problem.
How can you measure your eastness or westness using the sun when the sun spends all day gradually moving across the sky?
That's why for hundreds of years the only way of measuring your longitude was an extremely unreliable method called dead reckoning, trying to figure out how far you travelled using estimations of speed and direction.
This was often wildly inaccurate, mostly because currents don't have the common decency to tell you how much they've caused you to drift. And it turned out dead reckoning was a perfect name all day gradually moving across the sky.
That's why for hundreds of years the only way of measuring your longitude was an extremely unreliable method called dead reckoning, trying to figure out how far you travelled using estimations of speed and direction.
This was often wildly inaccurate, mostly because currents don't have the common decency to tell you how much they've caused you to drift. And it turned out dead reckoning was a perfect name for it.
In 1707, a British fleet under the command of Admiral Shovel found themselves in a dreadful fog in the English Channel. Shovel's navigators figured they were safely west of the coast. In fact, they were here, really close to the Scilly Isles.
Thankfully, aboard the ship was a seaman who had been secretly keeping his own navigational records, who told Shovel he believed they were perilously close to the islands.
Unthankfully, Shovel refused to listen to him and had him hanged for the crime of subversive navigating by an inferior, which was up there with the worst decisions Shovel ever made, apart from not changing his name.
4 of his 5 ships crashed into the rocks and 2,000 men died, all because of the longitude problem.
This sort of thing was happening too depressingly frequently. And so, in 1714, Queen Anne of Great Britain set up the Longitude Prize.
Whoever found a practical and accurate way of calculating longitude at sea would win £20,000, which in today's money is £20,000 plus inflation.
Many great minds tried to come up with a sensible solution to the problem, including Galileo, Newton, Halley and Cassini.
But all of these textbook nerds fell short, instead accidentally discovering other, less consequential things in their endeavours to solve the longitude.
The phrase discovering the longitude became a common way of saying something was completely impossible.
There was a theoretically simple answer to the problem. As the Greeks had figured out in one of the many years before Christ, the best way of mastering longitude was to master time.
The theory goes, if you know the exact time at a fixed location, you can use that, along with the sun, to figure out how far east or west you are. For example, if you knew that it was midnight in London, and where you were, the sun was at its highest point in the sky, you'd know you were on precisely the other side of the world from London.
The catch is, for this method to work, your clock has to be unforgivingly accurate. Just 1 minute slow places you 0.25 degrees west of where you actually are. At the equator, that's a whopping 17 miles.
In the 1700s, clocks worked on pendulums, and if pendulums ever had an Achilles heel, it was boats.
Keeping time on board a boat was so difficult, many sailors resorted to superstition.
In a bid to know the time at a fixed location,
they would stab a dog, put a bandage on it, take the bandage off, and put the injured dog on the ship. Then, every day at 12 o'clock, someone at home would dip the bandage in a bowl of sympathy powder. The dog on the ship would sense the powder and yelp in pain, telling the sailors it was noon precisely.
Problems with this method included keeping a dog constantly both injured and alive, knowing which yelps were the sympathy yelps, as well as all other elements of the plan.
So it was to the relief of dogs everywhere when the longitude problem was eventually brilliantly solved by a rather unlikely Yorkshireman called John Harrison. Harrison showed a keen interest in clocks from an early age. Despite never having any formal education or working as a watchmaker's apprentice and being too poor even to own a watch, before he was 20, he'd figured out how to build a working clock made entirely of wood.
Hey, check out my latest TikTok.
Harrison quickly made a name for himself, building clocks on a shoestring budget that never erred by more than a second in a month. By contrast, the best clocks in those days drifted by a minute a day.
When Harrison heard about the Longitude Prize, he excitedly turned his attention to building a device that had no pendulum and could cope with extreme changes in humidity and temperature at sea.
Thank you, thank you. May I present H1. It's the only clock of its kind. It's completely oil-free and pendulum-free, and it's performed perfectly on a test run to Lisbon. It's so accurate and seaworthy, it can solve the longitude problem. But I really hate it. Sorry, I'm a bit of a perfectionist. Would you mind if I came back in a couple of years with an even more perfect one? Ladies and gentlemen, H2. It's even more accurate than H1 with an improved, sleek design. But I still really hate it. Can I have a couple more years, even more perfect one? H3. It's even more accurate than... Oh, I've just realised it's huge!
Just as they were starting to worry Harrison was too much of a perfectionist to submit anything, he produced pocket watch-sized H4.
This I am happy with.
But, uncharacteristically for Harrison, it was a case of very bad timing. By this time, the new head of the Board of Longitude was Astronomer Royal Neville Maskelyne.
Maskelyne not only had the crucial say in who got the prize, he was also trying to win it. He'd been working on his own method of calculating longitude by mapping the position of the moon in relation to the stars.
Maskelyne, who openly described H4 as that plaguey watch, now decided it needed to pass a lot more tests.
He confiscated H4 and kept it in his observatory for 8 months. And by an amazing coincidence, in Maskelyne's own private tests, the watch didn't work so well.
At the age of 79 and with time running out, Harrison, encouraged by his family, went to snitch on Maskelyne to King George III himself, who said,
By God, Harrison, this is shocking treatment. I will see you right it. Ooh, can I have a go on your hammer? Bang, 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 bang.
In 1773, at the orders of King George, Parliament granted Harrison the honour of being the man who solved the longitude and awarded him the cash prize he deserved.
The Board of Longitude never approved the decision. Maskelyne was still convinced he could find a better solution with his moon charts.
But he never did.
John Harrison died aged 83 on the same date he was born, a timekeeper to the last.
The legacy of his chronometer would last for centuries, give or take a few minutes.
In 1860, when the Royal Navy had fewer than 200 ships, it had more than 800 chronometers, and Britain's naval dominance at the time was in no small part down to the navigational edge it gave them over their rivals.
If you want to find out more about the fascinating history of the longitude problem, Davis Sobel wrote an excellent book called Longitude, which is full of dozens more unbelievable stories and details we didn't have time for.
So, what was your favourite chapter?
The middle.
Why do I lend you books?
Psst, hey, laptop, are you awake?
What do you want, TV? I was on sleep mode.
I need to ask you something. Why have they stopped watching me?
Welcome to Map Men. We're Tip Men, and here's Tip Map.
Map men, map men, map, map, map men, men.
In today's programme, we're going to talk about counties.
Counties are the building blocks that make up Britain, the units you're expected to have heard of to help place towns and villages you've not heard of, such as Wingerworth.
Where?
In Derbyshire.
Oh, where's Derbyshire?
Arguably, the county that inspires the fiercest pride and loyalty in its inhabitants is Yorkshire.
Yorkshire is known for Yorkshire puddings, Yorkshire terriers and Yorkshire tea, which comes from this part of Yorkshire. With its distinctive accent, strong identity and intense one-way rivalry with Lancashire next door, Yorkshire folk are proud to tell everyone they come across that they come from Yorkshire.
And they're all wrong to do so, because Yorkshire doesn't exist.
Yes, it does.
All right, show me a map with Yorkshire on it.
OK. Here. This map of the 39 counties of England clearly shows a county called Yorkshire.
But this map of the 48 counties of England shows separate north, south, west and east riding of Yorkshire, but no single county called Yorkshire.
But my map is correct and up to date.
So is mine. And so is this one.
What's going on?
We're doing Mapmen.
No, I mean with the counties.
Well, the definition of county in Britain is a minefield of anomalies, asterisks, confusions, vague areas and contradictory Wikipedia articles. The more you look for answers about what a county really is, the more questions you come across.
Which is perhaps why no one's attempted to do a video about them before.
Even Google Docs won't let you type the word county without suggesting, did you mean country?
But we're not taking citation needed for an answer. It's time to do some actual research to find out once and for all, what is a county? And go!
Right, now that we've eaten all those biscuits, should we start doing some research?
I've done it all. The first time England was split into what we now call counties was back in the 10th century when King Aethelstan wanted to make sure all the same laws were being obeyed and all the same taxes were being collected all across England.
Which, curiously, is the opposite reason why you divide a nation up nowadays.
He split his kingdom into bite-sized manageable chunks and sent an earl to be in charge of each one of them.
How they got their names tells you a bit about how they were formed.
These were named after ethnic groups or old kingdoms that existed before England.
These ones that end in sex were part of the Saxon kingdoms which spread across the south of England.
And these ones took their name from the most important town, the county town, and added the Anglo-Saxon word shire on the end, the same word that sheriff comes from.
Shire, sheriff, sheriff, ooh!
And for our American viewers, it's pronounced sheer, not shire.
Actually, it's pronounced shire, not sheer, plebs.
Over the centuries, these areas have been controlled by earls, dukes, sheriffs, lords, and at one point, counts, which is how they came to be known as counties.
The precise location of exactly where one county stopped and another one started wasn't important in those days. Nobody tried to draw the boundaries on a map until the 1080s when the Normans did a survey.
Hello, Norman. I've done a survey of all the people who say they live in Worcestershire.
Thanks, Norman. I'll just add that to my survey of all the people who say they live in Gloucestershire.
Oh dear.
Oh dear. And that's how the fuzzy county borders became sharp lines, but with lots of panhandles, detached areas, exclaves and squiddly bits.
England's counties varied massively in size. The biggest, Yorkshire, was half the size of Wales, and the smallest, Rutland, was roughly the size of a Wales with 0 cities and frankly had no business being a county.
Harsh.
But these differences didn't really matter until... In 1888, the Prime Minister Lord Salisbury established administrative counties, making democracy local.
Each county would now have its own county council in the county town, in charge of local things like police, fire, council tax and so on.
But some counties were too big to be easily manageable.
Sussex got split into east and west.
And Yorkshire was split into its historic ridings, a word that meant thirds.
Ridings, ridings. Yeah, that sort of works.
In addition to this, big cities were given the status of county borough, which made them independent from the county they were in, effectively taking the Leicester out of Leicestershire, Derby out of Derbyshire, and Nottingham out of Nottinghamshire. So does this all mean that a united Yorkshire hasn't existed since 1888?
Well, not exactly. Strap in. The new administrative counties did not replace the historic counties. Both systems confusingly coexisted at the same time.
And the confusion was only going to get worse.
Lots of towns in Britain had the same name.
This often caused confusion, with many people's letters being delivered to the wrong place.
Which is why from 18-something onwards, the Royal Mail required that every address had to end with a county.
But because many post towns happened to spread inconveniently across county borders, the Royal Mail, for their own convenience, introduced the last thing Britain needed: another county's map.
The post office's counties didn't match up with the historic ones or the administrative ones. For example, the town of Ugly was in the county of Essex, but the address ended in Hertfordshire.
Which meant there were now 3 interpretations of what county you lived in: historical, administrative, and or postal.
As the centuries rolled on, the county system went from being confusing to being completely out of date.
After the Industrial Revolution, Britain's new big cities were man-spreading themselves across county borders.
And many county towns were no longer the commercial powerhouses they used to be.
The once mighty city of York had fallen to 5th place in non-existent Yorkshire.
The counties didn't reflect 20th century Britain in any cultural, practical or meaningful
sense. It was time for a complete shake-up.
The year was 1972, a time of optimism and experimentation in the first episode of Rainbow.
The Local Government Act of 1972 was a radical attempt at cleaning up the complicated, outdated counties mess both once and for all.
Brand new metropolitan counties sprang into existence, with modern-sounding names like Merseyside, Greater Manchester, West Midlands and Tyne and Wear.
London, of course, wasn't included in any of this, as they'd already done their own thing 10 years earlier, which Jay has previously discussed on a video he made without me.
At the same time, several traditional counties vanished overnight. It was county carnage.
Huntingdonshire got eaten by Cambridgeshire, Hereford got anded with Worcester, Cumberland, Westmoreland and this lump of Lancashire were all merged and given the horrible new name Cumbria.
And silly little Rutland was sensibly absorbed by Leicestershire.
Chances are nobody would have Battenberged an eyelid at yet another change to Britain's local authorities, but the government made a big mistake.
They messed with Yorkshire.
Yorkshire's borders got a complete meddling, creating a new South Yorkshire, which was cheeky, but when the East Riding got taken out of Yorkshire altogether and became part of the new Humberside, that was not on. It was off.
The previously Yorkshirean residents of Hull were not at all keen to be lumped with Grimsby on the other side of the River Humber.
It was a particularly bizarre union given the Humber Bridge connecting the two sides hadn't even been built yet.
There was an anti-Humberside campaign, and even anti-Humberside graffiti.
All this kerfuffle forced the government's hand, and in 1996, Humberside quietly disappeared.
As did other unpopular experiments like Cleveland and Avon.
Hereford and Worcester once again became Hereford and Worcester. Sure. Even ridiculous Rutland regained its status as England's smallest county.
The shake-up of 1972, designed to simplify things, did nothing of the sort, instead marking the beginning of an era where county borders, names and powers have been changing on an ever-increasing basis.
England today has 9 regions comprising 47 ceremonial counties alongside 6 metropolitan counties comprising 36 metropolitan districts, 26 non-metropolitan counties comprising 192 non-metropolitan districts and 56 unitary authorities, not including Greater London, which is a ceremonial county and not a county, comprising 32 boroughs, and the City of London, which is a district and a county and not a ceremonial county, and we haven't even talked about Scotland, Wales or Northern Ireland, where it's different.
Absolute state of this.
Although it may seem more impossible than ever to tell what and isn't a county, according to this particularly aggressive map publisher,
it's very simple. Our historic counties have never been affected, nor their boundaries changed by the endless shifting of local government boundaries over the past 100 years.
This is a view shared by the increasingly exasperated Association of British Counties, who seek to
give every county a county day, teach counties to school children, fly county flags in every county, stop using the word county for local authorities who are not proper counties.
Fruitcakes. The reality is, unless you live in a county that's particularly unusually proud of itself, like Yorkshire, in general not much of a monkeys is given about the county you live in.
And that might be because it just doesn't really matter. It's not like the USA, where laws vary from one state to the next.
Even Royal Mail doesn't care anymore. Thanks to postcodes, putting a county on your address has been unnecessary since 1996, despite the boxes they make you fill in on Amazon.
But just because they're not important doesn't mean we should forget about them. Present-day knowledge and understanding of English counties is in an abysmal state.
We stopped over 4 people on the street, and not a single one of them could faultlessly name every single county in England and its county town.
Well, we think that's a terrible shame, and it's about time something was done about it. Oh, there's Leicestershire, Oxfordshire, Rutland and...